hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry. And periodically, she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she'd take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew, as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend who had been texting earlier that said the woods just went completely silent. Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back.
Oh, nice.
What about you?
I thought it was just a weird bug on the ceiling.
Yeah, everybody thinks I'm like staring up at the sky.
Oh, what are you playing?
It's kind of like Final Fantasy Tactics. I don't know if you remember that game, but it's like a Final Fantasy game.
No.
It's like mixing. It's like mixing like an RPG with chess.
So you got like a really dope setup or what?
Nah, not that great. I got a cool screen though.
The nice like cool like arch screen that goes all the way over the top of you? Is that what's going on?
It's a pretty good screen. I don't know.
Let me see here. Let me see that shit.
It's like a.
Okay, there you go. You look like you're looking way further up than that.
Well, that's because like I'm down. My
Oh, okay, alright.
yeah, like I'd have to mount my. I'd have to mount my.
Thanks for the likes, guys. Thanks for the
I'd have to mount it right here, man.
I
Like.
appreciate you. Where you at? How old are you? What's your third favorite animal? What do you do for fun? What's
I'm
your
in.
social?
I'm in Arizona right now. I come from California. I don't do much of anything. I'm looking for a job. I'm looking for a job right now.
Oh, trying to get an old derb?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
what's up. I'm in Missouri. I'm at the track.
That sounds.
acting like I'm exercising.
That
but I'm
sounds.
not.
That sounds like misery.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You like that joke?
Let's go.
I'm just full of jokes.
How old did you say you were?
Me, I'm 33. I'm an old man.
33. Damn. How's that feel?
Old.
Like shit?
Yeah.
Or is it cool?
No, it's not cool at all. Nothing.
That is not what I need to hear. Oh my god.
It just.
See?
It
No,
just
he
goes.
does not, Derek.
It just goes downhill from here.
I had someone say that they said you look older than 33, but I don't think that you do. I think you look like you're like. Let me see. Let me look at
Here,
it.
hold on.
Nah. Nah.
It's
he looks
because
like
I'm
he's
gaining some weight.
20,
That's why.
Like just turned 27.
That would be my guess on myself. But no, I'm an old man. 33.
Oh yeah.
It's all the drugs.
How old you think I am? What do you think? What are you thinking?
What's
you won't
that?
offend me, bro.
On you? The same, 27.
You think I'm 27? Let's go.
Yeah.
No, that's close. I'll be 29 here in
All
like
right.
a month.
Yeah, there you go.
It's shitty.
It's all that run. Yeah, don't turn 30. You're
Oh, Carmen, what's good?
you're gonna be good until you turn 30, so don't worry. You got one more year of happiness.
Yeah.
You got one more year of happiness. Don't worry about that.
One more year of cool shit to do. All right, let's go.
Yeah, then you just go downhill.
He does. He does. He kind of does. They say you look like Robin Williams, like son or nephew or something.
Really, I've never heard that before. I heard like Jeremy Renner sometimes. Like that guy, Hawkeye.
I don't know who that is.
Hawkeye.
Robin Williams' nephew. Oh, Hawkeye. Oh, yeah. I know who that is.
Maybe when I'm old.
Yeah, no, I can see that too, actually.
Yeah, I hear that sometimes on
Hold on,
TikTok.
sorry, the sun's in your face, guys. Yeah, let me move over. There we go.
Yeah,
It's better.
I can do that too. Thank you for the
Yeah.
likes, man. Yeah.
Whoa! You got 8K followers. You're only following 92 people. What do you do, dude? How are you so famous?
I'm not even famous, man. I don't know. I just make videos.
Bruh.
This is my spare account.
Famous guy.
I wish.
Mr. Famous guy. Let's go. Thank you guys for the what was that? Six Fires Married. Let's go.
Dang, look at you, man. You're famous.
What do you make videos? What do you do? Gaming stuff?
Oh, on this? No. I just duet stupid stuff. I don't even like do anything. These are like I don't know.
Well, I'm gonna follow you and check out some of your content.
Cool.
And see what's good with it. Because you're already famous. Some people must be liking it. So I'm gonna see what's
People might like it.
Oh
It's
yeah.
just- Here, I'll follow you back. You're interested.
Alright,
I like people who are interesting.
I'm the famous 93rd. I'm the 93rd follower, guys. Look, you gotta be really cool for this guy. I'm actually honored. I appreciate the follow.
I like
Let's go.
people who are nice, easy to talk to on live. You know what I mean? Like, there's some people who are just boring
Oh,
and
dude,
they just sit there and they go, "Jump the screen."
Oh, I know.
And then
No,
it's
we
like,
we can chat it up. I'm actually, you're catching me out of my habitat.
Yeah,
Right now, usually I'm in a nice little. I got it going on, bro. I'm telling you. We'll do this again.
I got this chair, but I get every.
We'll do this again, and it'll be cool.
All right, I get everything at Goodwill. That monitor, this chair.
Nice.
It makes my setup look
yeah,
nice.
We'll do this again. I'm gonna go eat and shit, and,
Cool.
and I'll be in my natural habitat soon, bro.
All right, anytime.
It'll be on.
Yeah, usually I
Alright,
don't
have a
get.
good one.
All right, have a good one. Bye.
Later, bro.
What up? What up? Keeping it going. Hey, thanks, Gold Dog, for your support. Nothing exciting. So how's homework going, man? I'm sorry, man. I haven't been having the greatest days lately either, man. Feels like there's something wrong with my head lately. And it feels like it's getting worse. I hope things get better for you, man. Seem pretty chill. I appreciate the likes and the support, man. Got me 1,000K likes. Thank you. Maybe it'll help me. Hello, Nicole Forever. How are you?
¿Cómo estás?
Ah, así, así.
¿Cómo estás?
Así, así. ¿Y tú?
¿Cómo estás?
Ah, no bien.
Jesus, how are you doing?
Así, así. Well, that was interesting. Wasting my goddamn time. No, I'm just kidding. What's up, 1977? Oh, man. Sorry, I'm so bored.
The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something, but at the same time she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops.
Hello,
She
hello.
just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not
Hi,
tell
how
her
are you
husband Bruce
today?
about what happened to her in the tree stand, because again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They had
Shitty,
dinner, they
like
cleaned up, they
always.
sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails, and at some point,
I'm the
Bruce
most
reacts
negative
to something he's reading. He makes a
host in the-
sound. And
in
Jan
all of
hears him
the
and says, oh,
TikTok.
what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest,
pretty
and there was a
cool.
bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then at some point the light kind of went back into the forest, and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened, and it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and
Hello.
went inside
What's up,
because of
man?
it. As
How
Jan
are
is
you?
listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing, and as soon as he finishes, she says, what
You
time
can
do you
like
say
my
that
screen
happened?
if you
Bruce
want.
picked up how intensely she was
Oh,
asking
no?
him,
Okay.
and so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind, and she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head, and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again, and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens, maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image. because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, like, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story, and so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand, and where the sun was, and how far away this thing was, and everything about the whole layout. And eventually, Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us a timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions. As children, we are taught that there is no such thing as monsters, but the people in today's stories would beg to differ. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, this story has one of the most bizarre and tragic endings to any story I've ever told. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in There is one absolutely horrifying part of today's story. It's the part where Angela is under the bed.
April,
Believe me,
what's going
when we get to
on?
that part in the
How
story,
are you?
you'll know what I'm talking about. But before we get into today's story,
you.
if you're a fan of
Thank
the
you.
strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4,
I'm
even
catching
5
up.
times every week.
Not really.
And so
But
if
we're
that's
all
of
good,
interest
but
to you,
thank you for
then
the
the
likes. I
next
do
time the
appreciate
like
it.
button
How's
asks
your
you to
day
go
going?
get them a regular iced coffee, I want you to go to Starbucks and order a regular iced coffee, but with light ice. Then hand that sucker over
How's
to the
your day?
fool that is the
How
light.
is everything?
Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications
Yeah,
so you don't
yours
miss any
too.
of my
How is
weekly
yours?
uploads. All right, let's get into today's story.
That's good. Looks like it, you're winning. Look at you won. Except for this.
On January 23rd, 2005, which is actually a day that is remembered by the people of New York as Black Sunday,
Yeah, well,
Curtis
that was
Myron, who was a
exciting.
New York
I'll
City
talk to you later.
firefighter, was trapped on the 4th floor of an
No,
apartment
no.
in the Bronx.
No.
Blazing inferno. He, along with 5 other firefighters, are trapped on the top floor. There was no way
that's
out, and they
boring,
elected to
you know?
jump from
If
the
you're
4th
gonna be
floor.
boring,
And
I'm
unfortunately,
gonna feed
Curtis,
off that
along with
energy,
another
and I'm gonna be
firefighter, did
boring.
not
You
survive
know,
the fall.
you're
In addition to
exciting,
those 2 lives
I'm
that were lost,
excited.
another
You know
fire
what
had
I
broken
mean?
out
That's all I
separately in
want.
New York the
Thank you
same
for the
day
likes.
that claimed the life of a 3rd firefighter.
Wandy-
This was the
Wandy
largest loss of
Lee. I
life
don't
for the
even
New
know
York
how to
City
say
Fire
that,
Department
but
since
I
the September
appreciate it.
11th attacks.
Help me
Curtis's
out.
wife, Jeanette, and their 2 daughters, Angela, who was a young teenager, and Deneen,
I'm
who
just
was a little
playing
bit
this
younger than
game.
Angela, they were inconsolable. They never thought that their father, their husband, would not come home again. But they were faced with this horrible new reality where Dad wasn't coming home. The Black Sunday
Right now,
tragedy,
not
the
a lot
loss
of
of those
people
3
come on and
firefighters,
see
had become very high profile, and so news channels and media outlets were showing up at
One-
Jeanette's
oh,
property,
one
hoping to
deal?
get an interview
Is
with
that
she
it?
or her kids about what had
I'm-
happened, and they
you'd
were
have
just
to,
not
like,
interested in
say
that.
it
And so they
for
felt
me.
very
I'm
trapped
not
inside
very
of the
good.
house. And the house itself
One
had
deal,
been built by Curtis.
Or
He
one
had
deal?
literally built the house. And so it was just a constant
friend
reminder of
named
the
Sean.
sadness of this loss. And at some point, Jeanette just said to the girls, I think we should move. I think we just need a fresh start. This is too much. It's too
That's
much to be
cool.
here. Let's just move. And the girls were very eager to leave. So Jeanette starts doing some house hunting, and quickly she finds this nice little house on Long Island where they live, but farther away from the city, and it was sitting on an acre of land, which for the price that was being asked for it, it was
Well, it's very
unheard of.
nice to
They
meet
went
you.
to the
Thank you
property,
for,
and Jeanette
for
could
your
see that
help.
the house needed a ton of work. But all
I
of Kurt's
appreciate it.
firefighter
Thank you
buddies
for the
were very
likes.
eager to support Jeanette and her kids, and they
So I'm
offered
not
to
on my
come by
desk
and actually
right
help
now,
them do the
but-
renovations on the
Yeah.
house. And so Jeanette
Better
bought
help
the
somebody
house,
else
and
here.
very
Let's
quickly
do it.
she and her two
Let's
daughters
get some
moved in,
money.
and all of Kurt's firefighter buddies
Hey,
showed up
what's up?
and began this massive house renovation. I mean, they were basically tearing it down to the studs and
Just
rebuilding
chilling
the whole
here.
house. Because of this massive renovation project, a lot of the
do this
doors
effect?
and
That's how
windows
you
were
do
not
it.
secured, and so at night Jeanette felt really uncomfortable. So she went out and purchased 7 cameras to fit on the outside of the house to monitor the property, and all of the cameras streamed to her laptop where
I
she
have
could
that one
watch them at
too,
any
you know,
time.
some
And so she
people
found
do.
herself watching these cameras a lot on her laptop, just kind of reflexively watching what was happening around her property. And so one night, Jeanette's at her house, her kids are upstairs, and she's
How's
got her
your day
laptop
going?
open, and she's watching these feeds from the 7 different cameras.
How's your day going
And she
today?
admitted that it was just kind of fun to watch the cameras. It felt, kind of cool to see what was going on outside, but from the safety of your home. And she was watching one particular feed that was showing the edge of her
That's
property
cool.
where there was this big forest
You got, like,
that basically butted up
18
against the
wins in a
property
row.
where
You
there was a
must
swing
be doing
set and a
good.
driveway. And she was looking out at this big open front yard of theirs.
You're ready.
And from the tree line, she watched a figure emerge. It looked like a man in a cloak. Walk up to their
You're ready for
driveway and
whatever
walk
it
a
is.
little ways
Good
down the
luck on it.
driveway before stopping and staring up at the house. Jeanette was so caught off guard by what she was
What
seeing
was this?
that she didn't do anything. She just stood there watching this figure. And as soon as the figure had gotten there and was watching the house, it turned back around and walked back into the woods and vanished.
Hype
It was
it up.
late. Jeanette didn't know what
Hype,
she'd
hype,
even
hype.
seen. The cameras were not super HD, so she thought it must have been an animal or it was
Get it
just
going.
an anomaly of the camera itself.
You
So
got
at the
it.
same time that Jeanette is
Hey,
looking at her
tap that
laptop,
screen,
she's trying to make sense of this
Windows.
figure she's seen.
Windows.
Upstairs, the
Tap
two
that
girls are
screen
in their
for
own
me, just
bedrooms,
real
which are on
quick.
other ends of the
Give me
hallway.
those
Angela
three.
was laying on her bed with her back up against the wall, and she's reading a book, and she starts hearing tapping
I'm
along
really-
the same wall
I'm
their back is
losing
against, and she can
all
almost
of
feel it in her back. She puts her book down and sits forward and turns and is listening really intently to where the tapping had been coming from. And then she hears
There you
bang,
go.
bang,
Thank you,
bang.
man.
and
That's all I
someone's
needed.
trying to get her attention.
Now you
She
can
gets
get back
right
to
out of her
whatever.
bed and goes to her door. She opens it up
Thank
and
you.
looks
We're catching
downstairs
up.
because from where her door opened, she could look into the living room on the first floor, and immediately she saw her mom on her laptop. Her mom was not banging on anything, and her sister was in her room, and she was down the hall, and so that couldn't have been her sister. So she goes back in her room, and she's thinking to herself, I'm hearing things. She puts her ear right up against the wall, and as soon as her ear makes contact with the wall, she said it sounded like someone smashed the wall right on the other side of her ear. It causes her to freak out, and she goes right into her bed and throws the covers over her head, and she hides. What Angela didn't know is that down the hall, her younger sister, Deneen, had heard tapping as well, but her tapping sounds were not coming from the wall, they were coming from the door. And she thought her mom had come upstairs to see what she was doing, so she got up, walked to the door, opened it up, and there was nothing. She did the same thing that Angela did and poked her head down and saw her mom sitting on the couch. She looked down the hall and she saw that Angela's door was closed. It wasn't Angela. So she shuts the door, and as soon as it shuts, she hears 3 distinct taps on the door. She opens it up again, there's no one there. She too runs into her bed and jumps under the covers. The girls would say in interviews that the tapping sounds continued periodically
Thank you
throughout
for the
most of the
likes,
night,
though,
but at
Woodman.
some point they both managed to
I
fall asleep
appreciate
under the
it.
covers. The next morning, the girls go downstairs and they're in the
Hope you're
kitchen
having a
and they
good
tell
day.
each other what they had heard the night before. And they both start feeding off of each other because they both had this experience and didn't realize it. Angela would say to Deneen, yeah, I heard these tapping sounds. Deneen is picking up on her fear and she's saying, I heard tapping sounds. And the kids are really wound up. And that's when Jeanette comes into the kitchen and she sees her kids talking about something that seems really intense. And she goes, what's going on? What are you talking about? And they said, Mom, we think something's wrong with the house. We heard tapping sounds last night. This happened to me. This happened to me. And Jeanette just says, guys, it's a brand new house. We aren't used to the sounds the house makes. I'm sure it's just pipes or creaking floorboards or something. You guys are overthinking it. Don't worry about a thing. The house is fine. Over the following few days, some of the firemen that were helping renovate the house began to work on the basement. The basement was full of clutter. It was like whoever had lived there before had never taken anything out. Very old pieces of machinery and furniture and strange boxes and papers. And the first step to fixing the basement was just going to be emptying it. And so the firemen were removing things from the basement when one of them, his name was Tom, he was one of Kurt's very good friends, Tom discovered that on the ground, underneath all the clutter, was this large pentagram, which is a 5-pointed star inside of a circle that is almost always associated with satanic worship. Tom gets Jeanette to come downstairs, and he shows her what's in the ground, and he says, what do you want me to do about this? And Jeanette said, paint over it, I don't want my kids to see this. But what Jeanette didn't know is that the kids had actually been playing outside over the past couple of days out in that forest in their property, and they had found a number of pentagrams carved into trees, into rocks, carved into the dirt on the ground. They were everywhere. They decided not to tell their mom because they didn't want their mom to worry. So they're both siloing information about these pentagrams all over their property. A couple of days later, Angela was going to be home alone for a few hours, and Jeanette had given Angela some some chores, which included cleaning out the refrigerator. And so Angela's in the kitchen, and she's got the fridge open, and she's taking things out and cleaning off each of the different drawers. And she can't help but feel like someone is standing behind her. She kept turning around, and no one was standing in the kitchen, but she just could not shake this feeling that someone was behind her. And so she's looking at the fridge at one point, and she's about to just give up on cleaning the fridge and explain to her mom that she would just do it later, when all of a sudden she hears behind her this loud, like, explosion. She hears pots and pans and knives and forks clattering all over the ground, and she instantly turns around, and every cabinet, every drawer has come flying open, and all of their contents have come smashing onto the floor. She sprints up to her bedroom screaming and hides in the corner. Shortly thereafter, Jeanette comes home, she goes inside, and she sees the kitchen is an absolute mess. It looks like someone had broken in, and she starts screaming for Angela, thinking the worst.
Nice.
Someone's broken in. What happened to my daughter? She's running upstairs screaming for Angela. She finds Angela curled up in the corner of the bedroom. What's going on? What happened in the kitchen? And Angela just could not put an answer together. She was so shocked by what happened. So Jeanette tells her to stay here. She runs around the house, making sure that no one's there. She gets her laptop, goes back to Angela, opens it up, and she checks the footage. No one's in their house. No one's been near their house. All the while, Angela's just sobbing hysterically. And finally, after Jeanette is convinced that there has not been a home invasion, she turns to Angela and she's like, "What is going on? Why does the kitchen look like this?" And Angela tried to explain what happened, but it just didn't make any sense. And so Jeanette was getting frustrated with Angela and saying, "Did you do that down in the kitchen?" But when Angela didn't change her story and just looked terrified, Jeanette started to see that Angela wasn't lying. This incident really rattled Angela, and Jeanette would comment in different interviews that it was at this point that Angela began to withdraw quite a bit. She was really upset about what had happened in the kitchen, but there wasn't really a good way to handle it, and so Jeanette didn't know what to say to her daughter. Angela didn't know how to talk about it, and so it was just this awful cloud in their life that they had this really intense thing happen, but there's just no explanation for it. A couple of days after the kitchen incident, and the crew that had been clearing out the basement got to the point where they were ready to actually start tearing down drywall. And so as they start demoing the walls, they find hidden in the walls a journal. And it's this very old-looking journal with some lace wrapped around it. And one of the firemen gives it to Jeanette and just says, "Hey, I thought you might want to look at this. I don't know what to make of it, but it was in your wall." Jeanette opened it up and she began flipping through it, and she saw a date that was 1927, and she knew that was actually the date that this house was actually built. It seemed like this was a journal written by someone named Christina, who seemed fairly young. And as she's flipping through this journal, it really starts to take a dark turn when she sees diagrams of these ritualistic sacrifices of animals and of people that apparently were taking place in this house, because the diagram clearly indicated that it was happening in the basement. And even weirder is there was this room that they didn't know what it was for in the basement that was underneath the stairs, that it wasn't really a closet, it was all cement on all four sides. It was like someone had put a pocket of cement underneath the stairs, and they always wondered what it was. And some of the diagrams indicated that some of these sacrificing was going on underneath the stairs in that room. Jeanette decides to keep the journal from her kids. She does not want them to know that this was found in the walls. A couple of days later, Angela is in her bedroom listening to music on headphones, and at some point she thinks she hears someone call her name. She takes her headphones out, she goes to the door, opens up, looks down, and says, "Hey Mom, did you call me?" Her mom's like, "No." She looks down the hall and she can hear that her sister is showering in the bathroom at the end of the hall, so it wasn't her. And so, Angela, she has a healthy fear of this house because of really the kitchen incident more than anything else. But she's thinking, okay, I must have heard something, not a big deal. So she goes back into her room and she sits down in her bed, but before putting her headphones back in, she hears someone say, "Get Deneen." And it's coming from in the walls. Immediately she's terrified. Down the hall, she hears Deneen, who's in the shower, screaming bloody murder. Angela starts running to the bathroom to see what's going on with Deneen, right as Jeanette is flying up the stairs to go see what's going on with Deneen. They open up the door and Deneen is huddled on the ground screaming about some person in the bathroom with her. And she kept turning around and no one was there. Jeanette would say when she saw her daughter, she looked so scared she thought she was having a seizure. And Jeanette immediately grabs a towel, scoops up her daughter, she grabs Angela, and they leave the bathroom. They go running into Jeanette's room, and they get into Jeanette's bed, and they're all huddled there, and Jeanette's trying to ask Deneen what she saw. And so Deneen finally says that she was in the shower, and she heard someone saying her name, and it sounded like a male voice. And she's just looking through the frosted glass, and all of a sudden she sees a big hand land on the outside of the shower door. Jeanette felt so helpless. She'd lost her husband, her kids have lost their father, and there's all these strange things happening in the house. And Jeanette just felt like she couldn't protect them. It was around this time that Jeanette really felt like she should leave the house. But financially, they were really invested into this house, so it would have been very difficult to leave just financially. And then also, the amount of time and energy all the firefighters, all of Kurt's friends had put into renovating the house and gutting it and fixing it up. It was so much time and energy that she felt like she would be letting them down if she left. And she couldn't possibly tell them that the reason that she was leaving is because the house is haunted. And so she just felt trapped. A couple of days go by and everybody is just on edge in the house. Angela, Deneen, Jeanette, they don't like being there. And Angela just felt really cooped up when she was home, and she was just scared of being in the house. And so one night she decides to go outside and just swing on their swing, which was on their front property. Jeanette is inside the house doing dishes where there's a window that looks out the front of the house where you can see this swing set. When she finishes doing the dishes, she takes her eye off of Angela for a moment and she walks into the other room to sit down on the couch. She grabs her laptop, she opens it up and figures she can keep an eye on Angela using the security camera that was pointing in that direction. So she opens up the program and she pulls up all the camera feeds, and she's shocked when on the camera feed with Angela, she sees the same cloaked figure she had seen the first time she'd been looking at the live feeds, standing right behind Angela. And immediately she's up and sprinting outside, screaming for Angela. As soon as she gets outside, she hears Angela screaming for her mother before she's even seen her mother. And when she turns the corner, she sees Angela screaming in pain on the ground in front of the swing, and there's no cloaked figure anywhere. She runs over and she can see that Angela's ankle has been badly broken or dislocated. And so she scoops her up and she said, "What happened?" And Angela said, "Somebody pushed me. Someone pushed me off the swing." And they go to the hospital, and sure enough, she had dislocated and broken her ankle. When they got home that night, Jeanette opened up a laptop and reviewed the footage from outside. And she saw this figure walk out of the woods, and the swing was right up against the woods. And it goes right behind Angela and appears to push Angela and then goes back into the woods. Jeanette called the police. She showed them the footage, and they feel really bad, and they can clearly see what happened.
Look at that.
But there's no way to identify the figure that came out of the tree line. They just told them to be careful, don't go in the woods, and if you see this figure again in any of your camera feeds, call us right away, and we'll come right over and we'll do what we can. So at this point, Jeanette is terrified. She can't protect her kids, and she doesn't leave them really at any point.
I haven't had much
She's
viewers
24/7 in the
today,
same room with
so
her
I
kids.
understand.
They're sleeping in the same room,
all
and the only time she would leave them is during the day for very brief stints. And on one day, a couple of days after the swing incident, Jeanette needed to go to the pharmacy, and so Angela's going to be alone for about an hour and a half. And so her mom leaves, and Angela is in her bedroom, and she's sitting on her bed, and she's listening to music. At some point, she thinks she hears banging coming from somewhere in her room. Now, at this point, Angela's been pretty shaken up after living there. She had the incident in the kitchen where everything flew out of the drawers and cupboards. She's been hearing tapping and banging sounds. She has her sister's story about the hand on the glass in the shower. She just got pushed off the swing by some cloaked figure. I mean, she's scared of this place. And so every sound is going to terrify her. And when she started hearing that tapping sound, she took out her headphones, she looks over at her closet, and she can see that the doors are rattling. She is so immediately scared that she gets off of the bed and goes underneath and tucks up against the side of the wall. She could actually see the bottom of the closet, and she can see it still rattling, and she's tucked up against the wall. And as she's looking, the doors slowly slide open, and she sees a figure walk out of her closet that must have been standing there the whole time that she'd been laying on her bed. She said this horrible smell filled the room, and she said that it looked like it had human feet, bare feet, but it was a totally dark figure. It was hard to really pick out if it looked human or not, but it began walking around her room, and she believed it was looking for her. And she heard its footsteps as it walked all over her room, and at some point it walks into the hall out of her bedroom, and she's just laying there under her bed hoping that it doesn't come back. And then, when she thinks it's walked all the way downstairs, it goes quiet. And then she hears it running upstairs, running into her bedroom, runs right in front of the bed. Its feet are aimed right at her. It climbs onto her bed. She can hear the springs condensing right above her. And she's looking out wide-eyed, holding her mouth. And all of a sudden, its head appears looking down directly at her. And it's this dark face, sunken eyes. It looks like its skin is rotting off its head. And it's just staring at her upside down, looking directly at her. At this point, she screams, and the figure goes back up onto the bed, and now it's sitting right above her. She's screaming uncontrollably, and then she hears it get off the bed, but she doesn't know where it went in the room. And so for the next 45 minutes, she lays there, expecting this thing to come back. It knows where she is. It knows she's under the bed.
Thank you very
And
much.
she can hear it occasionally running around the house. She can just smell the horrible smell, and at some point, she hears her mom's car outside, and she starts screaming for her mother.
Thank you for
Her
more,
mother
man.
wasn't heard
We got
because
it.
she
We
was
got some
bombing
good
into the
points
house.
coming in.
She runs up the stairs.
I know
She's
it's only
screaming for
10, but
Angela.
we got
Angela's
it.
screaming for her mom.
We'll
And
catch
she
up.
finally finds Angela under the bed. She pulls her out. She holds her.
We're on
and she's
our
trying
way.
to figure out what's
Thank
going
you,
on.
Pam,
And
Pam.
Angela's saying that
Ah,
he's in
thank
the
you,
house.
Dominique.
He's
You don't
in the
even need
house.
to
He's
give me
in the house.
gifts.
I don't know what it is. He came
I'm
out
good
of the
with the
closet.
likes.
Jeanette runs all through the house looking for anything or anyone in the house. There's
We're all
nothing. It's
good.
gone. At this point, Jeanette is at her wit's end. She doesn't know what to do, so she takes Angela. She gets in the car. They drive to where Deneen is. Deneen was with a friend at the time. They get Deneen, so the three of them are together now, and they drive to Jeanette's parents' house. And while they're there, Jeanette calls a paranormal investigator, and she says, "I need your help. I need help to get rid
I'm
of
gonna
this
get
woman in
to
the
0
house."
points.
And
So
so she
we're
gets in
good.
touch with this woman named
No,
Liz,
this is a good
who offers
battle.
to do
I
a
like it.
cleansing of the
I
house.
like the 10
and after the
points.
cleansing was
I
done,
live
Jeanette
with
would
it.
say that it appeared that everything stopped in the house. And somewhat unbelievably, Jeanette and Angela and Deneen decided to stay in the house where this demon was. that they
I was
felt
gonna say,
confident that the cleansing
have
had
no
gotten rid of
hair.
it. And to this day, they still
Nice
live
with
there.
the
If it was
crown.
me, I would have been out of that
Thank
house.
you,
and
Gold
never
Dog.
gone back.
Hey, thank you.
So I'd love to get your
Bye-bye.
reaction to
Thank
this
you for the
story.
like.
Do you think
Hey, Linder,
there was some
Dominique, thank you
paranormal
for the
entity
likes.
that
I
was
do
haunting them in the
appreciate it.
house, or do you think
Lots
this
of
was just a
likes on
product of
this end.
extreme
It's cool.
grief and anxiety
Keep 'em
as a result of
coming.
the death of her
7.
husband and
We
father?
got 7
Or is it
people
something
watching.
else?
We got this.
Let me know what your theory is in the comments, and I
All
will do
you
my
need to
best
do
to
is
get back
all
to as
like
many of
it.
you as I
We
possibly
got
can.
this.
If you enjoyed this video,
We're
then the
gonna
next
keep
time the
this
like
up.
button asks
We're
you to
gonna
get them
keep
a
going.
regular iced coffee, go to
Thank you guys
Starbucks,
for tapping.
get a nice
Thank you
coffee,
for
but
the
ask
love.
for light
Dominique,
ice,
thank
and
you.
then hand
I
that joke of a
appreciate
drink
those
to the
roses.
fool that is the like button.
Thank you, thank you.
Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all
Dominique.
notifications so you don't miss
Keep
any
going.
of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads I do every week.
We're
If you have
gonna-
a story submission, we have a subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's
Let's
linked in
do
the
it.
description
We
below.
got
You can
this.
post your
We
story
got
there,
this,
and if
Gold
I
Dog. Thank
intentionally
you.
use
You've
one of
been
your
here from the
suggestions,
beginning.
I will
Let's do
absolutely
it.
credit you. If you want to get in touch with me, you can
Hey,
direct message
Pam,
me
we
on
got
Instagram. My
this.
username is John
And
Ballin416.
thank you,
I
Dominique,
also have a
another
Twitter account that I
rose.
really just started
Thank you,
using,
thank you.
and my handle is John Ballin416
We're good.
over there
Hey,
as well.
Inspired,
I'm also
thank
very
you
active
very
on
much.
TikTok, where my handle is Mr. Ballin.
Hey,
So whether
I
I
see
see you
you,
on
Dreamer.
Instagram, Reddit,
We got
TikTok,
this.
Twitter, YouTube, some
We got it.
combination of those.
15.
I'm just very thankful for your support, and until next time,
We're gonna,
guys.
hey, we're gonna break 1,000 too. Don't even trip. In 9
In today's top
seconds.
story, we're reminded why truth
We're
is
gonna let 'em
often
out of the
stranger
water.
than fiction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3,
That was
4,
closer
even
than I
5
thought it
times
would
every
be.
week.
No.
So if that's of interest to
Hey,
you, please
thank you.
offer the like button, a beer, and then give them emojis. Also, please
Hey, thank
subscribe
you
to this
very
channel
much, man.
and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories.
Hey, thank you, IC Dreamer. That I appreciate that, man. Coming in out of nowhere. We're getting close.
In the spring of 2013, a young woman
building.
named Melissa finally moved out of
You
her
probably
mother's
hop
house
on
and got her
another
own
one.
place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call,
Nah.
she'd
Maybe
answer, and she
somebody
could
will
hear
come
them
watch.
breathing, but they weren't
What are
saying
you
it.
guys doing?
And then
How's
she
your
started
day?
getting these
I
huge
see Dreamer.
bouquets of
Should
flowers
we do
delivered to
another
her front
battle, or we
step,
should
but
wait?
they were delivered
I
from
just wait
anonymous.
usually
Then
for
after
people to
that,
come
she
in.
started noticing things in her kitchen and her living
I
room were
can keep
going
going.
missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives, little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these
I don't
things,
know
they
where
really
I'm
stood
going.
out. Melissa had this
We'll
habit
see.
that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had
Is
this
there anybody
irrational fear
matching right
if she
now?
didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn
Nope.
down in the middle of the night.
Nope.
So she was pretty obsessive
Nope.
compulsive about
Nope.
always making
Nobody's
sure
matching.
the
What's
TV
going
was
on?
unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's
Girl's
getting
got
these
4
hang-up
people
calls
online.
and
You
flowers
think I
being
can
sent
beat
to her
her?
door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning, she gets up and comes downstairs, and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself
It's all
that,
right.
well,
I
she must
appreciate
have
it. You don't
forgot
need
to
to
unplug the
spam
TV.
too
As
much. You
rare
just
of
need
an
the
event
3.
as
I'm
that
all
is,
good.
it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug,
Yeah, we'll wait
confirming
until
that,
somebody-
yes, I've unplugged the
We'll wait
TV.
until somebody
Then she
comes
puts it
along,
down
man.
and looks
I
again
don't
at the
know.
outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely
I know, I
not
saw
plugged
you
in.
guys
And then she
spamming.
goes
I
upstairs to
appreciate
bed.
that.
The next morning, when she
Guys.
walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because
I
her
need a
TV
bigger
was right at the
following
bottom of the
online,
stairs,
I think.
that when she
I
turned
mean,
the
on my
corner,
lives.
it would be plugged
I
in
don't-
again,
I
and
don't
her
really
worst
have
nightmare
too
would come
many
true, that
people following
something
me
is
around on
happening on
live.
my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs
I
and
don't
turns
have
the corner,
people- I
what
don't
does she
have any
see?
of
The
those
TV
people
is
get,
plugged in again. She's
you know.
horrified, but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious
So,
act. And
it's
she's
cool.
telling
I do
herself,
appreciate
well,
it.
maybe I forgot again.
Oh,
But
here,
then she said,
somebody
no,
wants
I
to do
remember
it.
last night
Let's go.
staring at the plug.
Yo,
I
what's up?
definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one,
How are
everything is
you?
locked,
You wanna
but
battle
two,
or
no
what?
one else is in here. And when she's satisfied
To the
that, yep,
death?
it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV?
That's okay.
You know,
I'd
she can't
lose
do
too.
anything. And it was at
What
this
game are
point
you
that Melissa
playing?
developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she
Oh,
began
really?
going to bed so early at night
That's
because
pretty
she could
chill.
not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine
That's a
living
cool
alone,
game.
being
I
afraid of going down to your
haven't
first
played it
floor.
in a
How
while.
scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so
Yeah.
Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything
good.
outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet.
So
and she's
tap that
upstairs.
screen,
But
we got
eventually
it.
it does get dark
Woo!
outside, and she still has not fallen
Yeah, I
asleep.
thought it
And so
was
she sits up in
GTA.
bed and
I
she
thought it
turns on the
was
TV.
GTA
And
5
right away,
too.
the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand.
Ah, okay,
and so
I
she's
get it.
looking at the remote, remote, and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa
alright.
had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs
Of course
TV
it's fun.
was
I
connected to
played a
her
lot of
upstairs
them.
TV and vice
I like
versa.
the Need for
If one was
Speed,
changing
though.
the channel, in
The
real
Hot
time,
Pursuits,
the other
I
changed
like
the
to play
channel.
those.
And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels
I like
are
the
changing.
more
It dawns on
underground
her
look.
that someone
Hey.
downstairs is changing the channels.
Thank you
And so,
for tapping
frozen
me,
in
guys. I
fear, all she
appreciate
can
it.
think to do is turn off her TV because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off, and so in total darkness, in
Oh,
a
you
house
did?
she's already terrified of,
That's
she is
cool.
straining her ears to try to hear some sign
Yeah, I've
that this
been
is either something,
something, I
someone's
don't know.
down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's
Yeah.
sitting there, all she can hear is her
Yes.
own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her
Yeah, I've
chest.
been-
But she doesn't hear
I'm
any
playing a
sounds in her
game
house.
too, but
She doesn't
it's
hear the
not-
TV on. She doesn't
it's
hear
like a
footsteps,
Final
doors
Fantasy
opening,
game.
none of that. It's silence in the house. So after
But
what
nobody
probably
wants
felt
to
like
watch
an
that 'cause
eternity,
it's boring.
she just grabbed a pillow and clutched it in front
So I
of her,
just show my
and put her head
face.
into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out, and it's this huge relief.
Even
Because
though I probably
suddenly,
did
with
better
the
if I had a
sunlight
game
pouring
up.
in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself,
Always
you know
seems
what,
like
that
I
had
get
to have
banned
been
whenever
just
I
some
put a
anomaly
game
with
on.
Skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday
Yeah.
party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says,
Hey,
here's the
thank you
strange
very
things that
much,
are happening
man.
in my house with
Thanks,
Skybox
Bulldog,
and
for
all
all
this.
the
And at
likes
first,
today,
he
man.
looked at her
I
like,
appreciate it.
really,
See you soon.
what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on these specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the
Yeah, I
wall
only
two
got
separate
3 right
times,
now.
and then the Skybox
Usually
thing. So the
nobody
TV's
comes
kind
on
of
for
wrapped
me
up
until
in the
later.
weirdness that's been happening in her
Hey, I'll
house
see you soon,
and the
man.
missing items
I
in her house.
appreciate it.
And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a
Hey,
little bit weird,
Wardell,
and he
thank you
offered
for
to
all
live
the
with her for a
likes.
few days and
Icy
just see it
Dreamer,
for himself.
thank
And
you
as
for
they're
all the
talking,
likes.
their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there
Bulldog,
too. For 4 days, the
I'm
two
glad you got
brothers
your,
lived on the first
I'm
floor
glad
of
you got
Melissa's
your,
house. They don't see anything,
homework
they
done.
don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and
Huh?
knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so
I
finally,
used
when
to
the brothers
have
are
a
getting ready to leave after
car,
the
but
fourth
I
day,
can't drive
she was
anymore.
practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea
I
of
had
staying in this
Toyotas
house.
my
Her
whole
brothers
life.
reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her
like I
standards.
said,
It was
I
like 3
played
o'clock.
Need
So the
for
sun's
Speed.
getting close to going
The
down,
Hot
so she needs to
Pursuit
go
one, the new one.
upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips
used to
around her
play
house to
Gran
confirm
Turismo
everything is
back
shut,
in the day,
everything
but
is
I think
locked,
Forza's
no one's in the house,
gotten
everything is
better
safe,
than Gran
and then she goes
Turismo.
upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room,
What other
she
games
hears
do
the
you play?
unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor, and then she hears the TV turn on, and her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set
Yeah.
really, really
I don't
high.
like to
So
play
as soon as the
music
TV went
because
on,
I don't know,
it blared
first-person
all through the
shooters
house.
kinda-
And immediately the TV turned back off, because whoever turned it on
I
knew
get
that
bored
that was
of
going to wake up
quicker
whoever was in the
than
house.
most
Melissa
games.
doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in
Dang,
her
you're
house
going
was a little bit
106?
subtle. It was like she had to think about
You're
what
all
she was
good,
hearing
dude.
to
Don't even
confirm
trip.
it was
You don't
actually
need to-
happening.
you don't need to
Now,
tap
this
that
person
hard,
is
man.
just strolling into her house
All I
in the
need
middle of
is
the
the
night,
3
flipping on the
likes. I
TV and
appreciate it,
blaring
though.
it through the house. And so
You
she
do.
immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. And he picks up right away and she goes, someone's in the house. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can, and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother
Yeah.
pull up, as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence, and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him, and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you
Yeah.
see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police, and I'm going to call you right back. Now, Melissa
a-
knew what she heard was very real to her.
That is a
But to
pretty
have it
cool
confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now, confirmed.
Why,
They are
just
right
playing
downstairs,
with
and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her
No.
brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the
Sorry, I'm
police.
playing like
Meanwhile,
a
Melissa
police
is just
kid.
standing in this
No.
room, horrified, as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just
Hey,
walk
thank
over
you
to her
guys for the
door
likes.
and look through the keyhole,
Thank
which
you,
was
Dreamer. I know
oversized
you're
on her
still
door.
here,
And if you
man.
look through it
I
and
know
over to the
your
left,
fingers
you actually
hurt.
look downstairs to the first
You
floor.
can take
You only see a
breaks,
sliver
man.
of the first
Look at that, I
floor.
already got
And
the
so
3 up there.
very
We're
carefully,
good.
she walks her way over to the door, and as
I
she
appreciate
kneels
you,
down
man.
to look
How's
through
your
the
day
keyhole,
going?
her phone rings. It was in her pocket, and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing, and she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the
Wonder what's
keyhole.
going on.
And standing at the bottom of the
Look at
stairs,
my
looking
neck.
up at her,
I
is
have
a
a lot
man
of
with a hat
stuff.
pulled over his eyes, who's clearly heard the sound. And he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house,
Oh.
because it was a voice she didn't
Oh, that's
recognize,
right. Well, we got
screaming,
2
"I'm
wins.
sorry, I'm
Thank you, Dreamer,
sorry,
for
I'm
the like.
sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she
I
opens
was
that
like,
door
I-
because she
I'll
wants to
keep
help if
playing
she
that guy
can.
if you
And she
want.
looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding
Make me
something.
look good.
And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head. And it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for
So,
months.
Dreamer,
They don't know
how are
how
you,
he got
man?
in, and
Thank
he would
you
never
for all
tell
the
them.
likes. I do
But he admitted that,
appreciate
yep, I was breaking in almost every single night.
You
But he
follow
never
me?
gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him.
Thank you. I do appreciate it. I'm not really doing much of anything. I know
In
I'm
February of
I'm kinda
2013, a
boring,
young
but
woman named
I'll
Kim
talk to
finally
you.
moved out of her parents' house,
Anything you
and
wanna
she moved
talk
into
about?
this tiny
Okay.
little apartment that she absolutely loved. Kim had severe social anxiety. She could not stand being out in public, talking to people she didn't know, and so she would do everything in her power to stay indoors. She had a job that didn't require her to travel, and so having this little apartment was like her little oasis. When she was there, she was safe. If she had to leave, she was practically running to her car and running back so she didn't have to talk to anybody. In those first few weeks she was living there, as much as she tried to avoid all contact with other people, there was one person she was kind of forced to have an interaction with, and that was her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this awesome old woman named Olivia, who really took a liking to Kim and kind of looked at Kim as like her daughter. And Kim was surprised at herself for wanting to interact with Olivia. She was very comforting, and she was a really nice lady. And so even though they
Do you have
didn't
a name?
actually interact that much, they developed this relationship where Olivia liked to make food, and she'd come over to Kim's door, and she'd knock, and she'd leave it outside of her door, and she didn't expect Kim to come out and
Oh,
talk
that's
to her.
cool.
She knew
Yeah,
Kim
I'm
was
just here
uncomfortable being
playing,
out in public, and so she didn't push her to do that. Instead, she just expected her
just
to
here
eat some nice
playing
food, and
this
whenever
Final
Kim was done
Fantasy
eating, to put her
Tactics
dishes
game,
back outside the door, and
whatever.
Olivia would take it up, and she would go clean it, and that was that. And so Kim really grew to love Olivia and was very happy to have her there. It was like she made her feel safe. 2 months after moving into this tiny little new apartment, Kim started taking a new medication for her anxiety. Now, historically, she had taken a whole bunch of different medications and knew when you start a new one, it's not uncommon to have a whole bunch of side effects that you're just not used to, and they're kind of awful, and you need some time to get used to them. So at the same time she's taking this new medication, she starts to notice that she's forgetting things. Things in her apartment are being put in places she does not remember putting them. And things are going missing, and she can't remember where she put them. And so even though she was expecting side effects from this new drug, she was really frustrated with the memory loss. She also noticed this medication made her exceptionally drowsy, to the point where most days she had to take a nap for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day just to get through the day. Because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, she did not want to go to the doctors to get a different prescription or to even talk to the doctor about, is this normal? Because that doctor's visit would necessitate a whole bunch of interactions with people she doesn't want to interact with. And so she decided, you know what, I'm just going to take my medication, I'm going to let myself adjust to this new normal, and everything will be just fine. During the time period that she's experiencing all these side effects that she is attributing to her new medication, she got a delivery from Olivia. It was a Greek salad that she knew Kim loved, and Kim's psyched about this Greek salad. She brings it in her apartment, and she decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to have a nice day to myself. I'm going to go in my bedroom. I'm going to turn on
I'll look
Netflix.
at your
I'm going to eat this
videos
salad in
when I'm
bed. It's
done.
going to be awesome. And so she's sitting in bed. She's
Or
eating her
maybe I
salad.
can
She's watching
figure it
Portlandia,
out.
and then she falls asleep right in the middle. Like as she's eating her salad, she's falling asleep. She's so
there's
tired. When
somebody
she
in
woke
here.
up, she's like,
Let me see
wow,
that.
I've never fallen asleep
Yo,
that
what's up?
hard and that fast before. And she's literally still got the fork in her hand from eating her salad.
too much.
And then she
Just
notices
chilling.
on the other side of the
How are
bed, the
you?
left side of the bed, the sheets are all disturbed,
What's
like
up,
someone
what's
has been
up?
laying there. And Kim always sleeps on the right side
playing
of the
a
bed.
game right
It was
now?
almost like a compulsion for Kim that she could never sleep on the left side, like it was bad luck. And she reaches her
What are
hand
you
out and she
doing, man?
feels that side of the bed
I'm
where it's
just
been
playing a
disturbed and
game.
it's still warm. And so she quickly thinks to herself, well, I guess I must have rolled
Yeah,
over
yeah.
and laid on that side of the
It's all
bed
good.
and then rolled back to this side just miraculously,
What are you doing?
right back in the same position I was in with the salad fork still
Alright.
in hand.
Later,
and that's
bro.
when it kind of clicks in her head, like, that's not possible. That's not possible. So what does that mean? Does that mean someone's in my apartment right now? And so she leaps out of bed, she gets her phone, she enters 911, and she's ready to dial it, and she flips on all the lights in her apartment, she's running around, and there's no one in her apartment. The apartment's still locked. Everything's normal. And so she puts her phone away, and her heart's still racing. She's very
You can
stressed
tell
out
me.
about
I'll
what's just
look at your
occurred.
video when I'm
Because
done.
in her mind,
Fine.
in the back of her mind anyways, she knows she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is when Kim began to wonder, are all these strange happenings in my apartment connected to what just happened now? Because this incident right here does not feel medication side effect driven. And so all of a sudden she's looking at the other weird things in her apartment, like the missing toothbrush and the missing shoes and things getting moved around, as suddenly connected. And it dawns on her that maybe she's been blind to something else happening. Maybe someone is breaking into my apartment. So for the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk to see if there was any indication of somebody breaking into her apartment at any point. And there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut. The only thing that stood out to her was when she woke up in the mornings, her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a smell she was used to. It was like another person's smell, and
Is
it
that your
really
real name?
freaked her out.
That's cool.
She decided it's time to tell my parents.
I wish my
And
name
so
was like
when
that.
she tells her parents and she's describing out loud what's been going
I
on in
wish I
her
had a cool
apartment,
name.
it's the
Mine's
first
John.
time she's hearing herself say this stuff out loud.
John.
And it sounds way more creepy
John
and way more
boring ass
scary
name.
than it did in her own head. And so as she's telling them, she's becoming scared to go back to her apartment, and her dad picks up on that and says, hey, I'll go back with you, we'll look around your apartment and we'll make sure it's safe and secure, and then on the way out we'll check in with your landlady and we'll let her know what's going on. So she's brought in and everything's going to be fine. They go back to her apartment, they go inside, and when they walk in, everything looks normal. They kind of do a walk through the apartment, looks normal. But before her dad leaves, he says, hey,
Nope,
let me just do a
here's
closer
somebody.
inspection
Let's see.
of your
Oh,
whole
hey.
apartment. Let me look
Hey, what's
everywhere.
up, man?
Make sure there's not like some special
Yo,
way
yo,
to get
yo.
in here, just to give you peace of mind.
I fixed
and so
my
he went
hair.
into her bedroom and he starts looking around and he's lifting up the mattress and looking underneath.
With
And
the
then he
hat?
opens up her closet, which is this big closet,
Oh,
lots of
looking
clothes
good,
in there. It's
man.
not quite a walk-in closet, but it's big enough that you can easily stand in there. And her father reaches in and splits the clothes, and he uses his light to look at all of the
Ah,
back
man,
wall. And he
that's-
pushes on it, and he taps on it, and he sees if
Looks-
there's any sort of special
looks nice
compartment.
out
There's
there,
not.
though. You
But before he
fishing?
walks out again, he notices a little blurb of writing on the bottom right corner of the inner
Ah,
wall,
okay.
an area that you could only see if you were
Alright.
standing in the closet looking for strange things on
Yeah,
the wall
I'm
of the inside
still
of
in
this
the same
closet.
spot.
He kneels down to take a look at it, and it's this little tiny blurb of text that says, come back
haven't
here so I can
moved.
look at you. And the only way you could light it is if you were laying down in this tiny little corner
Why is that?
facing the exit of the closet. And that's when her
You're that
father
bad?
looks at the
No,
bottom
I'm
of the
just
closet,
kidding.
and one of the slats on the closet door was missing. And so, in theory, if you were someone that was writing this message, you'd
Yeah,
be
me
laying
too.
down, but your eyes would be looking through that slat right at her bed. Her father put
Yeah.
it together, and he stood up. He
Me
walked out to his
either.
daughter
I
and he said,
don't-
"Come
I
over
don't
here."
even fish.
He showed her what's in her closet, and he said, "Did you write that?" And she goes, "No."
I
And
think-
he goes, "All right, it's time
I
to
think
leave."
I'm gonna
They walk
fish
outside.
just
They
so
go
I
to his
can
truck,
get
and he
a-
calls the police, and he says, "Someone's breaking into my daughter's apartment." Police show up, and using CCTV footage, they capture a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the
Yeah,
night. And
I'll
clearly
probably
has
have
the
to
key.
do
It would
that
turn
when
out to be
I go
Olivia's
again. I'll
grown
probably
adult
go this
son
week
named
sometime.
Henry, who lived with her. Who
On
apparently,
Wednesday,
as soon as he
I go
saw
on this-
Kim for the
they
first
have
time,
this,
he
happy
fell
hour,
madly in love with her and became very obsessed
they
with
have
her.
this
And he
happy
developed
hour,
this fake
kayak
relationship
trip
in his
that we
mind
go on.
where he believed he and Kim were dating, even though Kim
Like,
didn't even know
it's like a
Henry
meetup
existed. She didn't
around
even
here.
know he was living with
And we
Olivia.
all,
She had never
like,
seen him
kayak
before. During
to this
questioning,
island
Henry
on
said
a-
what he did
on
is
one
he
of
got
the
sleeping
lakes.
pills and he ground them up.
And
And
then they all
anytime his
have, like,
mother
a
was delivering
potluck,
food
so
to Kim, which she
I'll
loved
probably
to
go to
do, and
that
she was
and
always
then-
excited about it, so she was talking about it.
Yeah,
so
I'll
he
go
would
to
know
that
what
and
was
then just
happening.
fish for a
He would
while
put
after
sleeping
he
pills
does
in
her
her
food.
food. He would mix it in, and then he
Hey,
knew
thank
as soon
you
as it
for
was
the likes.
delivered, she would be asleep, and he would use his mother's spare key to go into the apartment. And what he said he did is he never touched her. He never
That's
laid a
because you
hand
don't
on
have a
Kim.
fishing
Instead,
pole.
he laid
Yesterday
next
I
to
was
her
like,
in bed
I'm not
or
facing
watched her
anybody
from
with a
inside the
fishing
closet.
pole.
So for the 4 months that Kim lived in this apartment, where she believed every time she came inside and shut the doors that she was kind of away from society,
Just
she
have
could
it
just
out.
be alone
It
in her
doesn't. You
bubble.
can't even
But
tell
in
there's
reality,
no lake
there was some
behind you,
psychopath
you know?
just a few feet away from
except
her
for the car
almost the
just drove
entire
by.
time. When Olivia found out about all of this, she made a point to tell Kim she had nothing to do with it and she was
Yeah,
terribly
it's
sorry
like,
about
oh,
it.
he's night
Their
fishing. You
friendship.
can't see.
That would be funny, right? Here, hold on.
On October 17th, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters
Hey, don't
was
be
supposed to
cheating
join
like
his
that.
friends for dinner, but he never showed
I'm gonna
up.
call
His
you
neighbors
out.
knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door,
Oh,
that
there
was
it
locked
is.
too. They looked in the
Oh, look at
windows, it
that.
was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a
Except
key
for
to
the
open
car.
the door
The
for
car's
them.
gonna
When
sell
they
you
stepped
out.
inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down.
Wait.
He has been
Oh,
bludgeoned.
look
the
at
police
I'm
immediately
about,
draw
I'm
their
about to
weapons,
win.
and they're looking
Look at
around
this.
the house
Somebody
thinking
else
someone
came
could
in.
still
Hey,
be
what's
here.
up, you
And they
supporter?
clear the whole house.
Show
and
me
there's
some
no
love
one
real
there.
quick.
And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene
I
was.
think at night
Nothing
I'm
in the
gonna
house
just
was
have a
vandalized.
fishing pole out
Nothing
this
in the
window.
house was stolen.
Like,
And Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies. And so
Yeah.
the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But
I
then you
take
got to
my
remember
gamer
that when
chair
police
on my,
first got there, before they discovered his body, The house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry.
Oh,
and so
man,
whoever
come
was in there
on.
with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil
can't be
enough
cheating
to
like
have a
that,
key of their
man.
own, or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles, such as
I'm gonna
theft,
get my
vandalism,
I'm gonna get my
revenge, have
fishing
basically
pole
been
here in a
crossed
minute.
off. Not to mention,
Make
there was
sure I
virtually
didn't-
no evidence
make sure
of
I
who could
lock
have
this
done
one
this,
into
with the
place.
exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives
That's a nice-
agonized
what
over
kind of
this
pole
case,
is
but
that?
they
It's
got
all glow in
nowhere.
the dark.
9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house,
That's cool.
but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence, and she hears the
Well, it
tapping
doesn't look
that's
like you're
coming
ice
from the kitchen.
fishing. That's the
And
problem.
she thinks, oh, it's got to be
Yeah.
a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the
What are
other
you
side
fishing
of the
for,
kitchen was a
gophers,
door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches to the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams, and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent
It's
again.
okay.
She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police
gotta-
immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer
thought I
was
won the
back.
last one.
And
How
they're
come
looking
I have
all through
0
the house,
wins?
and there's nothing. There's not
Man.
even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper, Anthony Peters. They explain that they couldn't find anyone, but
I
given
know, I
the
thought I
history
won
of
the
the
last
house,
guy.
we don't think it's
It was
safe for you
just
to
some
be in
kid
there.
playing,
And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the
Fortnite or
hospital where she could
something,
be
I
looked
don't know.
after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have two
And I
detectives
won it.
that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so two
But then
detectives
I
go and
played
sit
another
outside,
one with him
for a
and he
couple
got
days and not seeing
disconnected,
anything,
so I guess it
hearing
ruined my
anything.
win
And they
streak.
decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't
Maybe
see
it was
anything, they
me.
go back downstairs. And as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs.
So
They
it
both
must
heard
have
it, so
been
they
me
go
who
upstairs and they start
disconnected.
searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom
blame-
and opens up a
blame me
closet,
for the
and
loss.
past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps
know, it's
head
gonna be
first
the
into the closet
best-
and
this is gonna be
grabs the
my only
foot of
win
this
of the
mystery
night.
person who's
Against the
crawling
guy with
into
the
a
fishing
tiny
pole.
little
Come
panel
on,
in the
man.
back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's
Yeah.
yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in, they both grab this person, and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest
Oh,
looking person they've
man.
ever
Oh,
seen.
see,
He
he
was
saw the
super
fishing
tall, but
pole. He's
rail
like,
thin,
"Oh,
and his
what's
skin
going on,
was
man?"
so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies,
That's
and he had
it.
been living in this house
I
for a
quit.
year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times, he was sleeping in alleyways,
Come on, come on,
and
come
as it
on,
started
we
to
got
get
it.
colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe
First
an
win of
opportunity to
the
crash his
day.
house for a couple of days. But as it happened,
First
when he
win
got
of
to
the
Phil's house,
day.
Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital.
Thank
visiting
you
his
for the-
wife who had a broken hip. And so the house was
Reset with the
vacant.
fishing pole.
And Conies
I
saw an
get-
opportunity.
let me know
and
how
he
it works.
broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take,
let me know how
in the
that
back
works.
of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything
probably
because
will
it was
work. That's the
impossible to
problem.
swim.
I don't-
You'd
I
have to be
don't-
incredibly skinny just to get
Sounds
through
like-
the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering headfirst in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't
Yeah.
extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Coney saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where
Woo!
he's going to live for the winter.
Six,
And so
right
he went
on the
around the house
board.
gathering supplies between
No
blankets
fishing
and
pole.
food and water, and he
No
filled
cheating.
his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door
No
again, made sure
cheating.
everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks,
I got my
Phil never noticed
GoPro.
a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's
See, on
wiring
Wednesday, I'm
system
gonna start
and
fishing,
stole
and
one of
then
Phil's
I'm not
radios,
gonna-
brought it into the cubby
I'm gonna
with him,
make sure
attached
my
it to the
phone's
new
charged,
wiring,
you know?
and he got
I'm
to
gonna
listen
make
to the
sure
news, so he didn't feel so
that,
isolated from
I
the
will
outside
have
world.
100%
But about
on
a
there.
month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going to the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over, and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, what are you doing in my kitchen? In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it
We
where
got
it is.
this,
He
USA
goes in the fridge,
supporter.
he
What's
gets more
going
food
on,
and
man?
drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives.
I don't even
He
know
would
what that
follow the
is.
investigation of Phil Peters' death on his
Dang,
radio,
you got the-
curled up inside
Yeah, I
of Phil
know, you
Peters'
were showing me
house.
that
Conies was
yesterday,
quickly
man.
found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's
Something I was
stories. And if you found today's secret, please let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. The first one to do that will get
Dude,
picked.
this
If
girl's
you enjoyed
got
the video
fucking
today and you haven't done this already,
Dude.
please offer the like button a beer, but then give them no duels. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If
Hey,
you want to get in
like
touch with
that
me, you can
stream,
direct
we
message
got
me on
this. We
Instagram
got
or
this
on
win
Twitter.
right
My
now.
username for
Let's
both
do
platforms
it.
is the same.
Number
It's
one
just
hacker,
John Ballin
USA
416.
supporter over
I
here.
also have
Let's
a
do
ton
it.
of content over on TikTok where my username
Get
is
it.
Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please
Get
submit
that
it to our
win for
subreddit
me.
just called
Dang,
Mr. Ballin.
look at
It's
this.
linked in the
He's
description
fishing.
below. So whether I see you on
He's fishing. I'm
Instagram,
gonna be
Twitter,
the
TikTok,
fisherman
Reddit,
right now.
YouTube, or some combination,
This-
just know that I
this is
really
what I've been
appreciate your
waiting for
support.
my whole
And
life.
until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Only level
Far
10.
and away, the scariest part of the story
haven't
is
even released
Jason's when
level
he
10.
brings the Dybbuk box home
We're on
and
level
goes to
5
bed
right
that
now.
first night
Oh,
and then
actually,
the
I
following
should
night
go
when he
off
sees in his
and
living room.
release
But before we get into
level 5
today's
right
story,
now.
if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place
I like
because
the
that's
new
all we do,
haircut,
and we
though.
upload
It's a lot
3,
better
4,
than
even
mine.
5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, at the next solar eclipse, offer the like button a pair of children's cardboard 3D glasses and tell them that they can look directly at the solar eclipse with these on. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly
I do
uploads.
that when I work
All
every
right, let's
day,
get into
like I wear
today's
that,
story.
hey, what time is it there, man? It looks dark. Look at it, it's like bright outside.
In 2003, Kevin Manis owned
About
an antique
7
shop
o'clock
right
at
in
night.
downtown Portland at the base of the Burnside Bridge,
Huh?
which is considered the gateway to the city. Because Kevin owned this antique shop, he was always at yard
What's up?
sales and estate sales looking to find the next thing he could sell at his shop.
You're
And so
breaking
one
up.
day there was this estate sale
Yeah,
over
in
at this woman's
Arizona.
house. She had just passed away. She was about 103 years old. She was a Holocaust survivor, and her
Right.
estate was being sold. And so he goes over to the house and he sees the way they're selling all of her items is by
you ever
bundling
wanna
them
lose-
in
if
different
you ever
lots.
wanna
So
lose
depending
with
on what
6
item it was,
points,
they'd be bundled
come
with
face
similar
me again,
items and
man.
then sold as a package. So the people there would be bidding on
Hey,
the
I'll
whole
face
lot.
you on
They couldn't buy
Wednesday. I'll have my
individual
fishing
items.
pole in the
And
water
Kevin had his
and
eye
we'll get,
on
like,
one particular
this'll be
lot called Lot
10,000.
29, and Lot 29 included a couple of small tools that
Oh,
he
look
wanted
at
to
he
sell in
got.
the shop.
Hey, where'd that 3
And
come
it had this
from?
mystery box, and that's exactly as it
You
was
jump
labeled.
on your
It just
other
says
account?
mystery box on it, and he was intrigued by it. And so he placed a bid on Lot 29, and ultimately he won the bid, and he was really happy about it. So he takes the
Mark.
contents of Lot 29 and he wheels them over to his car. And
You
as he's
got it.
loading stuff into the back of his car, someone behind him says, "Oh, so you went with the Dybbuk box, huh?" And Kevin, in his head, went right back to his childhood because
Let's
growing
get
up,
it.
he'd always been scared
We're
of
gonna
Dybbuks
win by
because
3.
a Dybbuk is a malevolent
It's gonna be the
spirit in
happiest
Jewish
day of my
folklore,
life right
and
now.
Kevin was
This-
Jewish, and
this
so
is
his
what I
parents
live
used to
for
say,
right now.
"Oh, you better not do that, Kevin, or the Dybbuk's gonna get you." And so he grew up terrified of Dybbuk's, and so his
I'm
interest is
kidding.
piqued.
I
And
hope
Kevin
not.
turns around and he says, "Did you just call this box a Dybbuk box?" And the woman's like, "Yeah," and my grandmother was terrified of it, and she said no one could ever open it. And Kevin turns to look at the box, and it's about 2 foot high by 1 foot wide, and there are these
we
little
got it,
doors
we
that swing
got it.
open
Come
in
on,
front,
guys.
and then on
We
the
almost
bottom there's a
got
door
this.
that comes out, and there's one
6
lock that
points,
sits
30
across
minutes,
the 2 doors, and
30
it's currently locked
30
with a little
seconds.
padlock. And he looks up at her and he goes,
We
"Why
got
can't you
this.
open it?" And the woman just
No more
says, "We
fishing
never
poles."
knew, but our grandmother would always go every time we said the word Dybbuk." And so it was weird enough that we just never asked any questions and we
We gotta-
stayed away from her Dybbuk
Thank
box.
you guys for
Kevin
all the
agreed
likes.
that was
I got
pretty
like
weird,
a
and he finished
million
loading his
likes
car,
right
shut the
now
trunk, said
for
bye to the
my-
woman,
for my
hopped in his
6
car, and he
points.
drove away. And
Hey,
he never
stop
really gave it a
fishing
second
in,
thought. At this point, he's not thinking the
cheaters
Dybbuk
over there.
box is anything malevolent. He thinks it's
Hey,
just
Mark,
some
just
random
jump on my
chest
side, give
that
me
he
some
won at
gifts.
an auction. Kevin drives back to his antique shop and he begins unloading all the things he won at the auction.
What's up?
He brings them inside and he brings them downstairs because the top floor, the main floor, was really where he sold things. When he got new items, he would bring them downstairs to his
Yes!
warehouse of sorts, which was much bigger than the first floor. Had lots of rows of shelving and had a workstation
You
down
should.
there.
You should
He would
just
bring his
quit.
new things down there and he would
Grab that
price
fishing
them and
pole
get them
behind
ready
you.
before bringing them back up. And at some point, he brought the Dybbuk box in and he brought it down and he put it on the back table. He was about to just leave it there and go back upstairs when suddenly he became really curious and he really wanted to open the Dybbuk box. And so he goes over and he kind of yanks on the front 2 doors.
That's
He doesn't
because
want
they
to
wish
damage
they were
it,
fishing,
but he can
that's
tell this
why.
lock is relatively new and it's not just going to come off. And so he doesn't have the key to it and he doesn't have a way to clip the lock. And so he takes a screwdriver
Yeah,
and
man.
he basically wedges it
That's
underneath the
cool.
actual metal clasps that are attached
Well,
to the wood. And he slowly kind of bends it up and bends it
I'm
off
gonna
and
think-
pops it out of the wood.
like I said, on
and as soon as he
Wednesday,
does
I'll
that,
be
the
out.
doors swing
I'll be out
open
on that
and there's like a
kayak.
mechanical device inside of the Dybbuk box that activates the drawer. Basically, anytime the doors open, the drawer also opens
Thank you
at the
for,
same time.
for
And Kevin
warming up
remembered
my
thinking how
audience
silly it
for me.
was that this kind of old, crummy-looking wine closet had this
All
fairly
right, later,
complicated
man.
mechanism
Have
inside
a
of it
good
that
one.
still worked. Inside the Dybbuk box were 2 pennies from the 1920s. There was a used candle. There were 2 locks
was a
of
nice
hair.
win.
There was this small
Yeah, the other
tombstone
day
that
I
said
faced
Shalom
that
on
guy,
it,
and
and there was
he
also
had
a
like
small
100
wine goblet
followers
that was
with him.
inside.
I
and
lost
that was
like
it.
5,000
And Kevin immediately
for
thought,
it.
well, this is just some older woman's keepsake, and these things maybe have sentimental value to her, but they don't to me. And so he shut the Dybbuk box, pushed it to the side of the desk, and walked upstairs and didn't give it another thought. Kevin had one employee at the antique shop. Her name was Jane. She was a younger woman. She was an incredible saleswoman, and Kevin thought very highly of her. And so the day after he had brought the Dybbuk box into the antique shop and put it downstairs on the desk, he needed to run out and do some errands, and so he put Jane in charge of the store. And so Kevin leaves, and Jane locks the front door to the shop behind Kevin because she needed to go downstairs and get a few items that she wanted to bring upstairs to sell that
What's
day.
wrong,
and
man?
it was before opening
you
time.
okay?
So front door's locked, no one else is inside the shop, and Jane goes down into the basement. Once you went down the wooden steps into the basement, you'd be looking out at this huge room of all these industrial shelves that run the length of the room where they would keep their antiques and other valuables on. And the lighting down there was never that great because they used these long fluorescent tube lights that at best cast a kind of subtle yellow glow on everything. They were not particularly bright, and it was a real pain to actually go up and change them because you needed to place a ladder, but the ladders were
That's
not
like level
perfectly
one
aligned
hackers.
with the lights. You basically had to reach over the shelving where all the antiques were, and you ran the risk of
Yeah,
knocking
it's
things
alright.
over. And so a lot of times
Yeah.
Jane and Kevin would wait until you were down to like one or
Like I
two
said,
crappy
usually
working lights
fishes,
before they'd say,
man.
okay,
He's usually a
we
lot
really gotta
better
go up
than
there and replace some of these bulbs.
Uh,
And so as
no,
it happens,
I
this
take
day
what I
they're
can
down to
get.
like 2 or 3 working lights. So in classic horror movie fashion, she's going into this dingy basement with very poor lighting. And so once she gets to the bottom of the steps, she walks to the far end of the room, a little bit away from where the Dybbuk box was placed on that back table. She's in the other corner in the back of this basement, and she's getting some things off the shelf when all of a sudden she stops, and she can't help but shake the feeling that she feels like someone is watching her. Now, she is down in this basement all the time, whether it's well lit or dark, whether Kevin is there with her or she's alone. This is a place she goes all the time, and she's never had this feeling before. There's no way to get into the basement unless you come down the stairs, and she locked the front door, and she was the only one who came downstairs. She hasn't heard anything. There's no other way to leave this space. So she doesn't know where she's
Yesterday,
getting
I
this
had
feeling
some
from,
Boeing guy
but you really
on
can't
the
shake it.
show.
And
I
as she's
love
kind of looking
football, that's
around and she's starting to get a little bit paranoid, the phone rings. They had a landline that was
Oh.
on a table right at the base of the stairs. The phone rings down there and
He's not
startles her.
feeling it.
Then it kind of jumps her back into reality, and she's like, okay, I'm getting paranoid. And she walks over and she picks up the phone, and it's actually her friend who was planning on coming by the antique shop that day. So as they're chatting, Jane hears what sounds like a broom. Imagine if a push broom is
here's
lined up
somebody.
against the wall and then it falls over.
Hi,
the
Abigail.
sound that the wooden
No.
stick would make as it hits
What's up?
concrete. That's the sound she hears as she's on the phone. And it startles her again, and she goes, hey,
I'm
let me
just
call you
chilling.
back.
Are you at a
She hangs
restaurant?
up on her friend, and she's looking out, and because the lighting is terrible from where she is, she's now at the foot of the
That's
stairs
cool.
looking down all these rows.
What are you eating?
And she's heard that stick land on the ground on the far side,
What
back
are
where
you
she had
eating?
been originally. She's kind of looking around, and she can't see anything. And so she takes a deep breath, and she begins walking down the rows to see what fell over. And as she's walking down the row,
That
something
sounds good.
smashes
I
behind
want
her. She
some
turns around,
pepper
and one of the
chicken
fluorescent
rice.
tube lights has fallen from the ceiling and
I
smashed
think I'm
onto
having
the ground.
Italian
And so
food
all of
of
a
some
sudden, she
kind
doesn't
tonight.
want to explore this falling broom that's behind her in the dark corner of the basement.
Yeah,
Instead,
I'm from
she's
Arizona.
ready to
What
leave.
about you?
And so she starts walking back towards the stairs to get out of here.
Arizona,
and as she's
what
walking
about
down
you?
one of these rows, a wooden chair that is on one of the shelves
Georgia.
comes flying off of it
Never
and
been.
lands squarely in the middle, blocking her path.
Actually,
And
I
there's
think
no
I
way
have.
this could have happened unless someone
I
pushed
think I have,
this
because
chair.
you
And
have to-
suddenly she
you have to
thinks
drive there to
someone's
get to
down here
Florida,
with me.
right?
And she screams and she hurdles the chair.
Yeah, then
and
I've
she
been there for a
runs to the
minute.
steps. She starts running up. And to her horror, there is a metal door that locks the basement at night. So if someone were to break in, it's another layer
I
to
eat
protect the
nothing
store
right
from
now. I
thieves.
was in sales.
And it
I
was
used
shut
to sell
and
tile.
locked. It can only be locked from the outside and with a key.
But I got
So there's
laid
no way
off,
she would
so-
have done this by accident. And
Now
now
I
she's
just do
freaking
this
out because
for a
she's
living. No, I'm
trapped
just kidding.
in the basement with some person running around pushing chairs
Not for a
over
living, I
and
just
breaking
do
lights.
this.
And so she grabs the gate and she starts shaking it and she's yelling for Kevin, thinking maybe he came in and forgot I was down here and shut and locked the gate. And she's checking over her shoulder, looking
Hi.
down into the
Are we
basement. And she starts
battling or
hearing
what?
more lights falling off the ceiling
Oh.
and shattering on the ground. She is in absolute panic mode. She's just waiting for someone to come bounding up the stairs towards her. She has no idea what to do. She pulls out her phone and she calls Kevin. Meanwhile, Kevin is making his way back to the antique shop. He's only a couple minutes away, and he sees his phone ringing that was sitting on the passenger seat. And he picks it up. And
What's
it's Jane.
Gorilla
And he
Tag?
answers, and immediately Jane is hysterical
play
and she's
Gorilla Tag?
screaming that someone's in the antique shop that's breaking things. And Kevin's like, slow down, what's going on? And all he can hear in the background is the sound of what sounds like glass shattering and things falling and breaking. And he's like, wait, what's going on? Are you okay, Jane? Like, where are you? And he hears her say, someone's in the basement. And he goes,
Hello?
where are you?
No.
And she's like, I'm in
Okay.
the basement. And he was like,
What
get
is
out of the
Gorilla Tag?
basement, call the police. But as he's trying to get her to do that, the phone cuts out.
I think
Kevin
your
was only
boyfriend
about a
got
block
jealous
away
of
from
you.
his shop, so he floors it to his shop. He parks outside and he's thinking to himself, what am I walking into? Is there going to be like an active burglary going on? Is she going to be held hostage? Like, are the police going to be there? But he just knows he needs to get in there to Jane, and he gets to the front door and it's locked. So he unlocks the front door and he goes inside and it's silent. When he's looking around, there's no damage to the first floor. There's no damage anywhere. And he yells for Jane.
think
There's
at,
no answer from Jane.
10,000,
And he
I
starts
could get a
walking
gamer
kind of
tag,
tentatively through the
and
store
it'd
towards
be
the
a lot
back. And he
easier
gets to
for
that
me,
door
because
leading
then I
down
can
into
just
the
run it
basement,
through
the
my
same one that
computer.
Jane couldn't open when she ran up the stairs to get out of the basement. And he looks at it, and Jane's not at the top of the stairs anymore. And he's thinking, I didn't lock that door, and I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. How is it locked right now? Does Jane have a key that I don't know about? And why would she lock it? Does that mean Jane's up here somewhere? Is that what happened? And he's like, Jane, come out. Did you lock this door?
So do a
But
lot
Jane's
of
not on the
people
first
play
floor,
Gorilla
and their
Tag?
first floor
Oh,
is
it's on
very
Oculus?
small. And so he thinks, okay, she has to be downstairs. And so he opens up the gate, he swings it open, and he starts walking down the steps. And he's really cautious as he's going down because, again, he has no idea what he's walking into. He hits the lights, but the lights don't work down there. And as he starts to bend around the corner where he can actually see into the basement, he sees Jane sitting at the chair right next to that table where that phone is, and she's just sitting there kind of stunned. And he goes to Jane and he's like, what happened down here? And he glances out quickly at all the rows and he sees all this furniture that's come off the shelves, and there's glass all over the ground, and he's looking at Jane, and Jane's just showing no reaction. She's sitting there like she's in shock. And he turns to Jane again and he says, come on, you got to tell me what happened down here. And Jane just goes, I don't know. I don't know how to explain what happened down here. I was walking down the row, and then I felt like someone was watching me, and then things are falling off the ceiling and the shelves. I've never seen anything like this before. Now, at this point, Kevin's adrenaline is through the roof. He came charging in here thinking he was going to have to save Jane from some person breaking in and breaking stuff. But as far as he can tell, there's no one here but Jane. And so he decides he's going to take a flashlight and he's going to explore the basement because either there's someone here or Jane did this. So he grabs his flashlight and he starts walking around, and all he sees is a bunch of broken glass and some furniture that's come off the shelves and a couple other things that are on the ground. But other than that, there's no one down here, and there's no other way to come in or out of here besides the stairs. So after Kevin is certain that no one else is here, he turns to Jane, and he regrets this now. He says in an interview that he feels horrible about this now, but at the time, he's thinking to himself, you know, this had to have been Jane. Who else would have done this? I don't know why she did this, but there's no one else here. And he goes, Jane, did you do this? And this is when Jane's emotions came through, because before she was in shock, now she's mad. And she goes, F you, Kevin. And she leaves. And she doesn't say another word to him, and she doesn't come back. She quits on the spot. But at the time, Kevin believed she had done it. So he was kind of like, oh well. He was not even a little bit thinking the Dybbuk box had anything to do with this. Just a couple of days after the basement incident, Kevin's mother was supposed to come by the antique shop, and the two of them were going to leave and get lunch together to celebrate her birthday. As soon as she walked into the shop, Kevin goes, hey mom, I got a gift for you. And he brings over this wrapped box, and he sets it down on the table right in front of his mother, who's sitting on a chair. And he unwraps it, and it's the Dybbuk box. Before Kevin can explain what it is, the phone rings at the other end of the store, and he was expecting a call, and he goes, hold on mom, I gotta get this. He goes to the back of the store to answer the call, while his mom is just sitting there looking at the box. And so while Kevin is at the other end of the store, his mother opens the Dybbuk box, and she says she had to sit down as soon as she opened it because she had this unbelievable, overwhelming sense of dread as soon as the doors were open. And she's staring at it like she can't take her eyes away, and then all of a sudden she has a massive stroke. And so she keels over, and she can't move, and she can't talk, and Kevin sees this happening, and he runs over, and he's like, Mom, what's going on? He calls 911, and as the paramedics are working on her, she would say that while she was in this kind of paralyzed state, when she couldn't talk and she couldn't move, all she wanted to communicate was to somehow get her son to get rid of that box. She didn't know why, but she felt like the box had something to do with her having the stroke. And so all she could do was move her eyes. And so she found herself with her son's right here, looking at the Dybbuk box and looking away, looking at the Dybbuk box, looking away, hoping her son would see her eyes as a signal to look at the Dybbuk box and put it together that that thing's bad. And Kevin does realize that his mom is flicking her eyes at the Dybbuk box, but in the moment, he's much more concerned about the health of his mother. And it wasn't until she got put in the hospital and she was being taken care of and he knew she'd be okay, then he remembers, he kind of went over it in his head later that day, that his mom was really scared looking, and she was looking at the Dybbuk box, like that was the thing that was causing her to be scared. Not the stroke, the Dybbuk box. And Kevin starts thinking to himself, I don't know, there's something off about the Dybbuk box. Either it's really bad luck, or there's some truth to you don't open up this Dybbuk box. Either way, I don't want to take any more chances, because so long as I've owned this thing, I've had a horrible thing happen in the basement, and now my mom's had a stroke, so I want to get rid of it. So Kevin puts the Dybbuk box at the front of his antique store, and he puts it up for sale. And very quickly, a young couple came into the store, and they bought the Dybbuk box. And Kevin's relieved, he's like, thank goodness, that bad luck charm, that whatever's going on with that thing is gone and out of my life. But just a couple of days later, he was in the back of the shop when he heard the door open, and then the door shut. He walked out expecting to see some customers, but instead he sees the Dybbuk box that's sitting right inside his store. Someone must have just dropped it off. And so he walks up to it and he sees there's a piece of paper that's been taped to the top of the Dybbuk box, and there's writing on it. And all it says is, this has an odd darkness about it. This really freaked Kevin out, because in a way, it was like other people were confirming that something was wrong with this box. Kevin did not want the Dybbuk box to be in his store, so he put it in his car and he drove back to his house and he put it in his storage locker and locked it up and then went back to work for the day. That night when he went home, he went to bed and he had this dream, where in the dream, he's walking in this courtyard and he's holding the hand of this woman who he believes is his friend, and he trusts this person, and the area he's in feels very friendly, and it's a very positive dream. And as he's walking, all of a sudden, this person starts to pull away from him, and he can't move anymore, and he's losing the grip on this person's hand. And they keep moving and moving until their hand is out of his, and they disappear into the corner of the courtyard where it's totally dark. And so he's looking into the darkness, waiting for his friend to come out again, and he can't move. He's anchored to the spot, and as he's looking, he sees what looks like an old woman walking out of the mist, and her head is down, phone, and he can't tell what she's doing. And she's pretty far away, and she's walking closer and closer to him. And when she's about 5-6 feet away, she raises her head up, and her whole face is falling off. All the skin is falling off of her face. It's rotting. She's like a corpse. And she raises her hands up in front of her, and then she grabs his face and begins pulling off pieces of his face until he suddenly wakes up. Kevin had to compose himself in bed because he was so scared from the dream he just had. He sits up and he goes into the bathroom to get a sip of water. And as he walks past the mirror, he notices there are marks on his shoulders and his arms that he did not have before. It looks like bruising almost. And he's looking at them and he's thinking, no way. That has nothing to do with the dream. This is just coincidence that, she was grabbing me in this area in the dream and now I have marks there. It's just coincidence. And so he kind of writes it off and he goes back to bed. And he has the same dream. He gets up again and he's breathing heavily, he's sweating because he just had the same dream. It was this terrifying dream. And he goes back into the bathroom and now his entire back is covered in bruises. He has bruises all over his back, all over his arms. He's got red marks on his neck. And now in his mind, he feels like it has to do with the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is now in my backyard. It's not a coincidence that all of a sudden I'm having these horrific dreams that are apparently manifesting themselves in bruises and marks on my actual body. And so Kevin is done with the Dybbuk box, and instead of going back to bed, he goes to his computer and he puts the Dybbuk box on eBay up for sale. And that night, 2 college kids named Sam and Brian, who lived in Missouri, they buy the Dybbuk box, and Kevin could not be happier to package that thing up and ship it off. Sam and Brian had seen the ad on eBay for the Dybbuk box, and at first it did not seem remarkable, but they saw that Kevin had given this really detailed description of all the strange things that had happened for him since he owned the Dybbuk box. And I think clearly Kevin's angle was he was almost trying to advertise it to groups of people that might be interested in that. And Sam and Brian were exactly that demographic because they were looking for things online that were considered haunted. They wanted to see if ghosts and the paranormal were real, and so they were eager to buy the Dybbuk box and test it out. And so 3 weeks later, when this package finally arrives in Missouri at their house, Brian was still out at class, but Sam was home, so he receives the package, he eagerly brings it into the kitchen, he unpackages it, and he sets it on the kitchen table, and just a few minutes later, Brian comes home, and Brian would say in interviews that when he walked in, it smelled like someone had peed all over the apartment, like there was urine everywhere. And he's walking around thinking, what happened? It smells so bad in here. And he walks into the kitchen where it was the strongest smell, and there's Sam proudly standing next to this awful-looking chest, which was, of course, the Dybbuk box. And he realizes, Brian does, that the Dybbuk box is what smells like urine. And he goes, Sam, do you smell that? And Sam's like, yeah, that's the smell of ghosts. Sam would pick it up and go, ooh, to Brian as soon as he walked into the kitchen. And Sam joked about how he couldn't wait to sleep in the same bed as the Dybbuk box. They were just making a big joke out of it. Sam had also set up a blog where he was going to document everything that happened from day one of receiving this Dybbuk box to whenever they got rid of it or till whenever something happened. And for the first 2 weeks they had the Dybbuk box in their possession, nothing did happen. But when Sam started bringing the Dybbuk box out and leaving it right in the middle of these huge parties they would throw, where people were spilling beer on it and they were opening it up and putting things inside of it and making jokes with it, when they were doing that to the Dybbuk box, suddenly they started seeing a pretty significant uptick in strangeness inside of their house. It started with their technology. Sam's laptop crashed and the hard drive was unrecoverable, so he had to replace his laptop. All of their watches just didn't work while they were in the house. No matter what they did, no matter when they fixed it, the watch just simply did not work. Their Xbox would not turn on, but when they brought it to another person's house, it worked just fine. It just couldn't work inside of their house. And the toaster, anytime you turned it on, it basically immediately incinerated whatever you put inside of it. But none of these technological difficulties were frightening to Sam or Brian. They were just frustrating. And I don't even think they were connecting them with the Dybbuk box. It was just this thing that was happening to them. It wasn't until the light bulbs in their house started bursting in the middle of the night that they started to get pretty creeped out about some of the things that were happening in their apartment. But now all of a sudden it did seem like, maybe if the Dybbuk box really is cursed, this might be how it would manifest. And so they replaced the light bulb, and then sure enough, it would burst again. And they couldn't keep light bulbs in because they kept popping. And so their house was dark a lot of the time. But the worst part was when they had this massive insect infestation inside of their apartment. And they were really localized around the Dybbuk box. All these insects would come out of the walls, out of the toilets, out of the sink. They'd come from behind the fridge, and they would all kind of like converge on the Dybbuk box and go inside of it. The Dybbuk box at one point was swarming with insects all over it, and they had to shut the door. They couldn't even go in the room with the Dybbuk box because it was just covered in insects. But despite how scary this was for the boys, they had become kind of like a cool talking point on campus because of Sam's blog that a lot of other students were following. And so the boys kind of liked the clout they got with that, and they decided they didn't want to get rid of the box after all. But it wasn't long after the insect infestation that Sam began losing all of his hair, and at the same time, he started having this constant hallucination that there was an old woman in his peripheral vision on either side of his head, pretty much at all times. Anywhere he went, there basically was someone he couldn't quite see following him around. Whether he was well rested, whether he was totally exhausted, it didn't matter. He always saw this shrouded dark figure that he believed was an old woman, and it scared him so much he couldn't sleep, and so he began going into Brian's room and sitting on Brian's bed because it was the one place he felt a little bit of comfort. And as he's sitting on the bed, he would see these dark figures standing on either side of him all night. And so finally,
Yeah,
no matter
when I
how
played
cool their
the-
blog was,
that
it
Century
became
of
too
Ashes
much, and they
game,
decided
it's
we
pretty
have to get
fun.
rid of the Dybbuk box. And so they put it on eBay, and very quickly it
Yeah,
gets
no,
sold to a guy named Jason,
you
who
knew
was
I
this
came from
museum director
California?
over at this other university in Missouri, and he had actually been following
He knows
along
I
with Sam's
kayak.
blog.
I am
He
a
was very
drone
interested
pilot.
in what was going on with the
And
Dybbuk
I don't
box.
really
And
have
when it was
any of
listed
that
for
on
sale,
my,
he was all over it. He wanted to buy it. So the boys eagerly ship off the Dybbuk
I don't
box, and
really
Jason
have-
receives it in the middle of a workday. So he puts the package in his truck, and he goes upstairs, and he works for the day. And then afterwards, when everyone's left the office,
Hey, so
he goes
cool. Thank
downstairs,
you
gets the
for sending
package,
me
brings
that
it back up to
pad.
his
I didn't
office,
know
puts
you
it on
did
his
that.
desk, and he
Sorry.
cuts open the packaging. Jason decided he wanted to evaluate the Dybbuk box the way he would evaluate any other antique or item that was coming into the
know
museum
if
that
you're
he was the
still here.
director of. And so
Thank
Jason
you.
starts by taking a whole
I
bunch
appreciate
of
that.
pictures all around the outside of the Dybbuk box,
Hey,
and then
there
he gets
you
his
are.
black
So
light
cool.
out and
How
he
are
begins
you doing?
scanning around the outside.
Hello?
And he finds all these
What's up?
traces of wax all over the outside, which leads him to believe this was probably used in some sort of ritual. And then he takes a deep breath and he sits down right in front of the Dybbuk box and he pops off the lock, he gets ready, and he opens the doors and the drawer slides out
Yeah,
with
as
the whole
long as-
mechanical
hey,
device.
what's
It all
going
kind of
on?
comes open.
How are you today?
And Jason's totally let down because nothing happens. And part of him
That's
thought,
good.
like, if this thing is haunted, as soon as you open it
What
up,
are you doing? Are
the
you trying
haunting's going to
battle, or are
begin.
you just
And nothing
chilling?
happened. And he's pretty let down about it. And so ultimately, after staring at it and looking at the pennies that are in there and the Shalom statue and the
cool.
locks of hair, he's just kind of let
There you
down
go.
by it, and he decides, okay, I kind of got my hopes up for something. This was clearly a hoax.
Why can't
There's
I
nothing
find
going on
my
here. It's
Steam?
just
I
a
am
random
having-
old chest. And so
My-
he closes
my
it up
computer's
and he
such a
puts it on
mess.
another desk that wasn't the one that he worked at, but
Yeah,
it
I
was just
just
kind of
typed in Steam.
another table inside of this office that he
I
shared
was
with some
looking
other
at my
people. And he figured it
desktop.
would be a good talking point to tell his colleagues about, and it would be kind of
My
like a
desktop's
showpiece.
going
So the next day,
crazy
his
over
colleagues come in and he explains what a Dybbuk box is and the history around it, that it's supposed to be haunted, and it makes people sick and gives people strokes, and there's been insects that have been known to come out of it and go into it. It's this very creepy thing, and his colleagues are like, wow, that's pretty cool,
See?
but they don't think much of
Look
it
at all this crap.
until all of the electronics inside of their office start to fail. Namely, their computers start
Trying to
crashing,
find
and their
something.
IT department comes up, and they're like, we don't know why this is happening, but sorry, we can't recover it. And the light bulbs kept going out to the point where they went out and got this huge pack of extra light bulbs to
This game's
replace the
pretty
light
fun,
bulbs
too.
as they
Island
went out.
Saver?
Something they never had to do
Kind of a
before,
kid game,
but all of a sudden, the Dybbuk box is in the
I
room,
kinda like
and the light bulbs are going out left and right. And then finally, Jason's coworkers that share that space with the Dybbuk box, they all got sick. And they blamed the Dybbuk box. They said, you know what? We were fine
I
until
blame
that
the
thing came
Dybbuk
in here.
box.
Now all of a sudden our computers don't work, the lights don't work, and we're getting sick. Get rid of it, Jason. So that
I'm
day
looking
after work,
for,
Jason goes and takes the
Gorilla
Dybbuk box,
Tag or
puts it in the
whatever.
back of his truck,
I'm gonna-
and his truck had a cover on the back.
gonna
So he
screen
secures
it
it in the
as soon as I
back, he
get
drives
2,000.
home, and he doesn't want to bring it inside
I'm getting
because it just
close.
seemed weird to bring a
There you
cursed
go.
object inside that
Banana
his coworkers
fruit
just made him get
or
out of
whatever
their
it is.
space because it was making them sick and it was ruining their things. So he thinks, okay, I'll leave it in my truck overnight and I'll figure out what I'm going to do with it.
Bye, have a good day.
He goes inside, he says hi to his family, and before long it's time for bed and Jason goes to sleep. In order to understand what happened to Jason, you need to understand the layout of his house. When you open the front door, you walk inside, and there's a wall on your right-hand side. That's the side of the
like it
house.
scared
And you walk
everybody
forward
away
about
from
5 or 6 feet, and on your left is a staircase that goes up to the second floor. If you walk up that staircase, straight ahead of you is going to be a bathroom. If you go left and walk down the
Yesterday I had
hall
a
another
bunch of
5 or 6
viewers,
feet, you
and,
come to the master suite where Jason
yes.
and his wife would sleep. If you walk through that
Okay.
door, there is a wall on your left where there's
I'll
a
finish
big
up.
bay window that looks out onto the street. And there's a big street light that sits right outside that projects very orangey yellow light into their room at night. Even though they have a shade up, it's this orange glow that comes through this window right here on this side. And then on the other side of the room is the bed. And the bed is situated where the feet are pointed towards this window over here, and the head of the bed is against this wall. And it's centered on this wall here. And Jason, if you were looking overhead at the top of this bed, Jason's on the left side, so he's the farthest into his room, and his wife is the
Yeah,
closest
but
into the
it-
room. So
Age
that
of
night,
Ashes,
Jason goes to
that
bed and he
game
falls
is-
asleep.
is
Just
free,
a couple
though.
hours later,
If
he
you ever
wakes up
wanna try it,
suddenly
it
and
is
he
on
can't move his
Steam.
body. He can only move his eyes.
Um,
He's laying on his back, and the light from the street light is very strong. It's this orangey glow in their whole room. And he's laying there trying to move his hands and his legs, but he can't do it. And as he's doing that, he starts hearing footsteps out on the stairs. And they're distinctive sounds. Slow, plodding steps all the way up to the second floor. And Jason's laying here with his eyes looking towards the door because his door is open and he can barely see into the second floor landing. And he's waiting to see who came up the stairs. And his heart's racing and he's looking, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees what looks like a dark figure begin to walk into the room. And his heart starts racing even faster when he can tell it's definitely not someone he knows. It's this woman, this older woman with a shawl over her head, and her head is tucked down so he can't see her. This is all out of the corner
Yeah,
of his
you're-
eye.
you're
And because of the
basically,
orange hue
riding
coming
a
in from the
dragon,
window,
and you
he
go
can
around
definitely
and
tell that
destroy
there's a
the dragon.
real solid figure
So you're flying
right there.
around
This is not in his
shooting
imagination, it's
missiles
right there.
and
And this woman
flamethrowers.
begins shuffling her way across the
it's-
foot of the bed,
it's actually
and right
pretty
at the foot of the
fun, like-
bed, as Jason's looking at her, she turns
Like I
and looks
said,
directly at him. and then she runs around the corner
I'd love
and
to
she looks
see
down
that
at him and she
TikTok,
takes her fingers and she
but
drives them into his eyes.
you're not
And
really-
Jason thinks it's real and he's screaming in
You don't
pain
have
and he
to-
wakes up and his wife is grabbing him and she's like, Jason, what's
I can
wrong?
mobile
And he's like,
stream
what's going
right
on?
now.
And she says,
I
honey,
have
it's just a
enough to
bad
do
dream,
that,
you're fine.
but-
And he's shaken up, his heart's still racing from this dream he's just had. And he's
I
trying to
don't
think,
have
like, that
to-
felt really real. And he's like feeling his eyes. And he can't believe that that was a dream. That was the most vivid dream he's ever had in his life. And so
Yeah,
eventually
it's
he goes
free,
back to
too.
sleep. And then the next morning when he gets up, he goes in the bathroom and he looks at his eyes and they're all red around the outside and the whites of his eyes are
called-
covered in
oh,
blood.
it's
His
sensory
eyes
gauge
look
of acid.
horrible. Like he's having this
Acid.
terrible allergic reaction to something, or it looks like someone might have punched him in the eyes or maybe gouged his eyes. That's how it
But,
looks. And his
you
wife
know,
comes in and she's like, what happened to you?
basically-
And he's like, oh my God, I have no idea. It was around this time that Jason began to think the Dybbuk box might just be cursed because the two previous owners have said in their disclosures on eBay that
Well, I
horrible,
was gonna show it to
vivid
you, but I
dreams,
think it needs
just like the one he
whatever.
had, to include physical manifestations, are part of having this Dybbuk box. Jason considered just dumping this thing in a dumpster somewhere, but then he was concerned that he might be passing on this Dybbuk box to someone who wasn't ready for it. And so he decided he would give it another day and he would do some research about how to properly dispose of a Dybbuk box. And so that night when Jason came back from work, he left the Dybbuk
Probably
box
gonna
in
have
his
to go
truck
to
covered
lunch
up in his
dinner in a
driveway. And so
second.
Jason goes inside, he has dinner with his
I'll probably
family,
be
and then he's
back
sitting
in a
down
little
in the TV room and he's watching TV with his son. And as they're watching TV quietly, Jason
Not
hears
a
his son
thing.
say,
What
hey
the
dad, who
hell?
is that? And he looks over at his son, and his son is pointing behind him. And Jason turns around, and standing right behind him is the same woman who had come in his room with a shawl on that gouged his eyes out in his dream, and then she suddenly disappears. And Jason's looking at his son like, you just saw that too? And he's like, yeah, who was that? And so Jason grabs his son, he yells for his wife and says, we have to leave the house right now. His wife comes downstairs and she's like, what's going on? And he was like, I will explain in the car, and we have to take your car. And so his wife sees how serious Jason is, and she says, okay, and they get into her car and they drive down the road, and that's when Jason explains what's going on with the Dybbuk box and how he and his son just saw the same woman that he had seen in his dream the night before that gouged his eyes, and his eyes were red, and his wife's starting to get really scared, and his son's really scared of what's going on. And so the solution they came up with was they were going to drive back to their house, drop Jason off, who was going to get in his truck where the Dybbuk box is still in the back, it's still locked in the back of the truck, and he's going to drive it a few miles outside of town to a rental property they owned that no one was staying in, and he was going to put it in the basement, and it was going to stay there until they figured out how to dispose of it, because they didn't like the idea of just dumping it somewhere, because they felt like if this is real and it's actually this cursed Dybbuk box, then somebody else is going to be cursed by this Dybbuk box unless we find a way, or at least attempt to find a way to contain it and destroy it. And so Jason gets dropped off, he gets in his truck, he drives to the rental property, he puts it in the basement, he seals it up, and he goes back to his house. Once Jason got back to his house, his wife and his son came back as well, and that night, Jason would go on eBay and he would find the contact information for Kevin, the original owner of the Dybbuk box after the estate sale. And he called him that night, and Kevin actually picked up, and the two of them spoke, and Kevin ultimately agrees to help Jason find a way to properly dispose of this Dybbuk box. And what Kevin offers to do is drive back to the house where he had originally purchased this Dybbuk box and see if he can get some more information about what it is and what they do with it. The next day, Kevin, the antique shop owner, he goes back to the house where he originally bought the Dybbuk box at the estate sale. He knocks on the door, and an old woman comes to the door, and Kevin introduces himself, and he says, hey, I was here not too long ago, and I purchased lot 29 that included that Dybbuk box, and I wanted to know some more information about it. And the woman reacted, and she's like, I told my family not to sell
is
it.
Undertale?
I know
I don't
what was
even know
inside
what
of
it
it,
is.
and I know you're not supposed to open it, and I tried to tell my family, and they didn't listen. I really hope you didn't open it. And Kevin's like, actually, yeah, I did open it, and he described all the horrible things that happened, and he described selling it, and all the subsequent owners, how they've had all these issues, and how they've arrived at this place now where Jason in Missouri is having all these issues, and they're trying to find a way to dispose of it, and that's when Sophie describes what's actually inside of this box. Sophie said she lived in Poland before World War II with her cousin Havila, who was the woman who had passed away, and all her things were being sold at the estate sale. And she said that at the time, it was all the rage to have seances and try to talk to dead people and spirits, and they would just do it for fun. Sophie, Havila, and their mother, they would do this for fun. And Havila had made this
How's they
Ouija
gonna let me
board
play
where she'd stitched letters onto this blanket, and they put it over this table, and they would all hold this pendant that was suspended by a chain, and they would ask questions, and they would hope that, a spirit that they were interacting with would interact with this chain, and it would swivel around
I'm just
the
in the
pendant, and
corner.
it would point to the different letters whenever they asked a question, and it would spell out, whatever their answer was.
No, I mean,
and
like,
Sophie said nothing ever happened. It
all
was
I
just
could
kind of a
see
fun
is
thing
like
for them
a-
to do. But one time it
there's
did
a
work,
gorilla,
and they
and I
said the
think it's
chain
stuck
would
in
go
place.
rigid, and it would point over and over, and it would spell the words, release me, release me, release me. Sophie said the women were incredulous and didn't believe it at
Hello,
first, but then they started to worry that if they didn't help this thing, that if it were a Dybbuk and were a malevolent spirit, they would
You got a
find a way
concert
to
going
attach
on?
itself to one of them. And so Sophie said they
Good. It
devised
looks-
this ritual where they released it, but into this wine box that they were able to shut.
Wow,
and lock.
look at that.
And that wine box became
It
the
looks
Dybbuk
beautiful
box.
where you're at.
And that Dybbuk box is the same one that was
Thanks
sold
for
to
the
Kevin.
invite.
Kevin told Sophie that, what do? We've already opened it up. And she said, you need to contact a
from
rabbi.
California.
And so
What
they
part
would
are
call a
you?
rabbi, and apparently they were able to reclaim the Dybbuk inside of the box and lock it and put it away in a secret location where
I'm
it's
from
been since
California.
2003. And apparently since it's been sealed off, Jason
Me?
and Kevin have said they've experienced no
Ontario.
demonic activity, and they never plan to tell anybody where this thing is because they don't want anyone else to
Yeah.
have even the
Not as
opportunity
exciting
to
as where
reopen
you
the
are.
Dybbuk box and have to deal with all the horrible things that they went through. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell
In
us in the
Rialto?
comment section and tell us
Next door?
where you found it. So what's the timestamp? And if you're the first to do that, we'll
That's
pin
not
you
Ria-
at the top
that's
of the
not
comment
Rialto.
section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, at the next solar eclipse, please give the like button a pair of cardboard, flimsy children's 3D glasses and tell them with these on, you can look directly
Where
at the
are you?
solar
That
eclipse and be
looks
totally
like,
safe.
Newport
Also,
or
please
something.
subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4,
Oh,
even
Palo
5 video
Alto.
uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr.
I've been
Ballin.
there.
If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It is linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Huh. What's going on? Sounds beautiful though.
Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in national parks and forests all across North America. One former police detective named David Politis has begun investigating thousands of these very strange disappearances, and he outlines his findings in a book series called Missing 411. Today, I'm going to be looking at
Nice.
3 cases that all fall
You got
within
a
the Missing
serenade.
411 phenomenon, where everybody involved claims to have been chased by someone or something out in the middle of nowhere. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even
must
5
be
times
Orange
every
County.
week. So if that's of interest to you, please give the like button a gift card to their favorite restaurant, but don't load any money onto it. Also, please
Alright.
subscribe to our channel
Very
and turn
nice
on
to
all
meet you. I'm gonna
notifications
go
so
eat
you don't
dinner.
miss any of our weekly uploads.
Thank you.
All right, let's get into today's stories.
You're welcome. Thank you, friend.
No problem. I'll see you guys later.
In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark, she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before, and so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail. So it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she'd seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks off the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest, and she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long she hears this, but luckily they don't come up right to her tent, so there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, when the sun comes up, she is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her, but again she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set, and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail, and she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack, because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place, and at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning, she jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to the hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear, that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really required to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then, after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again.
Plugging it back in again?
No, I just use the air fryer.
On June 7th, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister, aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone. And they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids, and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them, and so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here, and that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind the log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking, how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area, and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not going to not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this, this is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a
Can
4-year-old,
you
and I can
beat
tell you
my
right now,
Pokemon
there's
Dream
no
Team?
way they could cover a 3.5-mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. And his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for 2 NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time, and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at, and for the entire weekend, it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time, and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes, and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way, and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off, and then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen, and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey, Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up, in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location, and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points, and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar, and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it. And when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area.
Still no
They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia, and so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him, and then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, I think someone's following me, but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety, but he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go unanswered. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp, and the first one to do that will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please give the like button a gift card to their favorite restaurant, but don't put any money on it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See you. If you weren't already afraid of the woods, you will be by the end of this video. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please release a massive saltwater crocodile. So if that's of interest to you, please release a massive saltwater crocodile inside of the like button's house. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. August 2nd, 1963, 4-year-old Bobby Panknin, along with his 2 older brothers and his 2 parents, headed off to a camping resort on Deep Lake in Washington State. The following day, Mrs. Panknin, whose name was Edna, decides she wants to take her 3 sons down a logging road that was right behind their campsite that she had heard fed out to this beautiful little waterfall that she thought her sons would like to see. Edna gets the boys ready, she says bye to Mr. Panknin, and then she and her sons take off down this logging road. And as soon as she's on the road, it occurs to her that it's totally overgrown, the grass is really high, it's rocky and bumpy, and she's thinking to herself, there's no way any vehicle is getting down this road, and probably there's been no vehicles on this road for a very long time. This is a very isolated place on this campsite. So they walk for a little ways on this overgrown logging road until they see there's a turnoff that leads down to the water and this little waterfall. And so right away she saw there was all this brush they were going to need to walk through, and the ground looked pretty rough. And Bobby, her youngest, the 4-year-old, he didn't have shoes on. He was going through a phase where he refused to wear shoes, and so it hadn't really mattered the entire duration of walking up the road, but it seemed like this might be too much for him to walk on. And so she told Bobby to wait on the road, and she told her other son, Jimmy, the 6-year-old, to wait next to him. Those two would stay on the road together while she and Bill, the 10-year-old, would go past the brush, go down to the water, check it out for a couple of minutes, and then she would come back, she would pick up Bobby, and Jimmy would come along, and then they would go down and look at the water, and then they would leave. Bobby didn't seem to mind, so he just sat on the road, and Jimmy was a little bit frustrated that he couldn't go with the first group, but he sat down too, and Bill and Edna took off past this brush down to the water. Now the distance between where Bill and Edna and where Bobby and Jimmy were was only about 10 feet. There was just this brush right in the middle of them that did obscure their view. They could not see each other, but they are very close to each other. And so Jimmy is sitting next to Bobby, and he's getting increasingly more and more restless. He wants to go down and look at the waterfall. He wants to be down there with his older brother and his mom. And so at some point, he just can't take it anymore. And Jimmy does something that to this day, he regrets every single day. And that is he got up and left his brother. He went through the brush down to where Bill and Edna were. And as soon as Edna saw him, she was mad at him, and she goes, "What, you left Bobby up there? Come on." And so they turned around after about 60 seconds and went right back up. And when they got back, Bobby was gone. And at first, they're not like, oh my goodness, someone's abducted Bobby, because there's no one on this road. They'd come up here and recognize that it's very remote, it's isolated, there's no cars that come through here, they hadn't heard anything. And so their first instinct was, okay, he probably got up, and is behind a tree, or he walked down the hill over here, or he's nearby. And so they're yelling for him, they're walking around, and no one's panicking yet. In fact, really, Edna was just annoyed with Jimmy that he had left, Bobby, and that he's to blame right now, but it's just an inconvenience at this point. But after a couple of minutes, when they can't get Bobby to yell back where he is, they start to realize they might have a problem here. And so Edna becomes more panicked, and she's yelling at the top of her lungs for her son. She's having her other 2 sons go look down by the water, go look over there, but there's no trace of him. And they can't believe it. It didn't make any sense, because, he's 4, he's got no shoes on, they didn't hear anything. How could he be gone? But he was gone. And so finally, after a couple of minutes, Edna rounded up her other 2 boys, and they ran all the way back to the campsite where they got Mr. Panknin, and they hailed the police, and very quickly, a big search was launched up on that logging road. As soon as the police arrived, the first thing they did is they pressed Edna and the other 2 boys about, what did you hear? You had to have heard something. He was only 10 feet away from you, and he was within earshot of you, certainly. What did you hear? Did a vehicle come through? Did you hear an animal? Did you hear anybody talking? And Edna and the other 2 boys, they swore that they heard nothing, that they're just as baffled by it as anybody else. And so the police really didn't have a good starting point of where Bobby could have gone. And in that area, there wasn't any, steep drop-offs or obvious places that Bobby could have fallen into or gotten trapped. The water for the waterfall, it's not deep. It's this little tiny brook. It'd be difficult to drown in that little brook. So they just basically started fanning out in all directions, hoping they would, find a piece of clothing or some other clue that would indicate where he went. After 3 days of searching that yielded nothing, they finally brought in a bloodhound to try to find him based on scent. And so they had the dog smell one of Bobby's shoes, and the dog immediately seemed to key in on his scent in the area where Bobby had gone missing. And the dog turns and starts running up the logging road away from the campsite, so farther into the forest. And it runs for almost 2 miles, and it never seems to waver. It's clearly picked up Bobby's scent. And it stops at this fork in the road about 2 miles away from where Bobby had gone missing, and it keys in on this one area right at the fork where there wasn't anything significant. It was just this bare patch of dirt. And so the police, they uncover the dirt a little bit. There's nothing there. They're looking around the area. That there's no indication that Bobby was ever here. So they give the scent back to the dog, and again, the dog just keeps tracking to this one section in this fork in the road. But they didn't know what to do with that information because there was nothing there. The search for Bobby was called off after 7 days because they could not find anything. And so the lead investigator came out and did this press release where he basically said, we have no idea what happened to Bobby. However, we do think he was abducted. And his reasoning for this was pretty straightforward. Bobby was a young kid that had no shoes on in an unfamiliar forest, and he was only out of eyesight for 2 minutes. So how far could he really have gotten? Certainly not far enough that his family wouldn't have found him after those 2 minutes were up and they began looking for him. And so if you go down the abduction rabbit hole, you start with, okay, a person must have taken Bobby. But for a person to take Bobby, that means a person had to be in this area that was super isolated and remote, and they hadn't seen anybody in the area, and there were very few campers at the campsite. So realistically, if a person was going to abduct Bobby, they had to have been planning it and had to have been hiding in the trees and were stalking this family until they got to that spot where Jimmy left Bobby, and then this person, runs out of the tree line, runs over to Bobby, picks him up without Bobby making a sound, he muffles him, and he runs away into the woods carrying this child, all in a 2-minute window, which was a totally abrupt window. It wasn't like this obvious thing that Bobby was going to be left alone. It looked like Jimmy was going to be sitting there with him, which would have been a deterrent, you would think, if someone was trying to abduct Bobby. But nonetheless, this window presents itself and this person runs down and takes Bobby. It just seems like that person would need to be really fixated on Bobby, 1, and there wasn't a clear reason for why anyone would be very fixated on Bobby or this family, and 2, they would need to be very strong and quick and agile, more than the average person. So we're talking like a professional athlete level of agility and physical fitness. And so while it's certainly possible that a professional athlete had been stalking this family and then ran down in this tiny little window of time and stole Bobby away without getting detected and then evaded the law for 7 days in the middle of the woods, while that's possible, it's pretty unlikely. And investigators reached this conclusion. They thought, it does seem pretty unlikely that a person did this. So they moved on to animals and they said, okay, maybe a bear took Bobby. And so they brought out bear sniffing dogs to search the area for signs that a bear had been there. And there hadn't been. And so they said, okay, maybe a cougar had been there. And so they brought out a cougar expert who looked around the area, and there's no signs of a cougar in the area. Plus, there was no blood anywhere around the area where Bobby had been taken. There was no drag marks where if a predator were to grab you, they would need to drag you away. There was no drag marks. So it seemed like, okay, the large predator theory also has problems with it. And so the next theory offered up was, well, maybe a giant eagle swooped down and picked Bobby up and flew him away, which would account for why maybe it was quiet and there was no drag marks, there was no blood, and why he's just gone. But that was when authorities said, okay, we clearly have no clue. And so that's why they gave the press release and basically said, we just don't know. And so while we probably will never know what happened to Bobby, it does seem likely that something took him. And whatever that something was, it was intelligent, it was fast, it was strong, it was agile, and it had been watching that family. Because as soon as that 2-minute window presented itself, where Jimmy was gone and Bobby was vulnerable, it swept in so fast that no one heard it, no one saw it, and it took Bobby somewhere and did something to him. And whatever it did, it probably wasn't good. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside, and so the pair decided, you know what, we got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. At some point, they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map, and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight, and it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But, I mean, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute, and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense, and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of this situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders, and for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree, and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around, and he realizes, there's no road over here. I am in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute, thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around, and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground, and so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? So he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge, and he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow, he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially, the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the 2 older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the 2 girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside, and so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other, and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking we're gonna find her. So they go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back, and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking, and so they call the police. The police show up, and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the Army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to the swamp, and there are thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. they found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves. That's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased, because they would have been able to pick around with the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow, and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off, and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture, despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed, and two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big, running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that, unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please release a massive saltwater crocodile inside the like button's house. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our 3, 4, even 5 weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is a classic don't go in the woods type of story. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. When they say yes, put their blindfold on and then replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoors men and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous, and it's right in the middle of the Northwest Territories. And it's this 11,000 square mile stretch of just pure wilderness that's called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was made into a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, so there's no hotels, there's really nothing inside of it, and there are no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane or by boat or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet, because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man. It is really nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, that literally overnight just was gone, leaving behind their shelters, their food, their supplies, just gone. No one knows what happened to them. Or the tribes have abruptly fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribes people have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, three brothers, Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, who all lived in the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They figured because so few people had ever been inside of this valley, that if there was gold to be found, then certainly it had not been found yet. And so after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs and trains and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the three brothers, they're on their boat, they're making their way up the Flat River, and at some point they pull off onto the riverbank and they set up camp. And then once their camp is set up, they go down to the river and they put their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is this long, skinny box that's usually made of wood, and it has a strainer on one side. And gold miners will put it in the water, submerge, and they will kind of shovel the sediment on the bottom of the water into this little funnel, and the big stuff will get stopped by the strainer, and the dirt and the water will just kind of flow out the side. And so the idea is you can trap gold nuggets inside of this sluice. And so the three brothers, they get their sluices up, and they start looking for gold, and right away, they hit pay dirt. There is tons of gold in this river. And so all day, all night, they get all this gold. The next morning, they do the same thing. And by the time all their containers are literally filled to the brim with gold, they decide, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. And so they pack up their tent, they pack up all their supplies, and they put everything back in their boat. They get out onto Flat River, and at some point, very early on in their journey back, the boat capsizes, and the boat actually breaks apart from the strength of the rapids of Flat River. And so the boat actually just sinks, and much of their supplies sink, including all of their gold. But the three brothers are able to grab some of their supplies, like the rifle and some lumber, and some of their mining supplies, and they swim it all to shore. They catch their breath. They're totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they're alive. They have enough supplies to survive. And so they figure all they can do is maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they did still have a sluice, and then try to get out of there and then, regroup and come back another time. And so using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and then also by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat and then hopped back on the Flat River, and they went back up to that site where they'd found gold earlier. They set up their sluice, they set up their camp again, and this time they didn't find any gold. So all day, this very disappointing day that they've already lost all their gold, now they're not finding any more gold. And so that night when they went to bed, they decided that the next day they were just going to leave. And so the next day they get up, they pack up, they hop back on the Flat River on this new boat they built, and they're able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they get back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, start talking about how they want to go back into Nahanni Valley and go get more gold, because now they know there's gold out there. It's not a question, yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, he wanted to get the gold, but he felt like, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go. I'm going to stay. And so several months goes by, and Frank and Willie have been doing all this preparation for this additional trip into the valley. And finally, in 1905, they're ready. And so Willie